And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I fought the law, and the law won.
Mm-hmm.
I guess as we were going on air tonight, the Defense Intelligence Director of the DIA has been fired by President Trump. And that came on the heels of the raid on John Bolton, the former national security advisor, who seemed to want to go to war every 10 minutes. But these things are interesting, and I think they reflect this kind of wave of infighting going on in the background that shows us so much about what's going on tonight in this very special episode that is going to draw in so many of these elements deep, deep, deep in the government factions and in mystical factions. So that's why the Illuminati is there in the title. In the Special X Series episode 202, Illuminati Deep Events Secret Network. Of course, the continuity of government players and the deep state players and some deep events like World War II, the Great Depression, the JFK assassination, Iran-Contra, COVID. Yeah, they're all kind of interlinked in some strange way, including the deep events to come. And if history is any reminder, then we could be looking at the next event being from space. Isn't that fun?
Mm-hmm.
It's been a very unusual kind of week in this sense with the things that are coming out and all the European leaders coming in to America reminded me very much of our World War II period and how so much of it is strangely under the radar. But over the past 3 or 4 months or so, I've been along a line of research of a very mysterious group operating in the background, which has some very interesting roots. And when I crisscrossed it, very unusual because the group itself operates in the same kind of milieu as a deep Masonic group or a secret society. But what was interesting here is I noticed it was showing up in deep state literature over the years and putting it together with a very unusual figure in history. A whole lot of things just exploded out of that, and that's what we're going to get into tonight. That's why Roosevelt's in there, because oddly enough, this figure was married to Roosevelt's daughter, and his name was Curtis Bean Dahl.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very interesting guy indeed. And we're going to get deep into him tonight. I'm going to remind you that we are going to take your questions tonight in this special episode. And in the second half of the program, Miss Olivia is putting those together and we'll have them. You can ask them at any time during the course of the show. And let's stay on the topic tonight because this is going to be explosive all around. And it's going to tie into some very unusual things that are happening right now as well. So the cross current there is just going to be explosive when we learn that the World War I, World War II, various deep events over history tie directly into this period. We're going to understand the nature of the environment we're in. And it is a strange environment. There's no question about that.
Mm-hmm.
Before I go any further, what's the temperature out there?
Great. Everybody's in a great mood. Sammy says things are getting cray-cray out there. And Seeing Sight says FDR said that in politics, there are no coincidences.
Well, he was a master politician. And, if you can picture the kind of Iron Man that he was going through World War II, going through the Great Depression, however people will look at his policies or, the good, the bad, and the ugly, but there's something incredibly historic and fated about the life of FDR. And it comes very early, too, because he's born into that milieu. And we go back into his history and we find that we're going to be looking at the person, for example, one of the early founders of communism is hanging out back there. And wouldn't you know it, he's connected with a very, very unusual secret society. And that's back in 1840. And he is, in fact, a cousin of Theodore and Franklin. And his name is Clinton Roosevelt. Very, very interesting, very, very intelligent, but very, very unusual inspiration. And the Illuminati in the title is interesting because I'm going to do a few things. I think people very often wing it with the title Illuminati, but I've known for, a number of years what the thrust of the name itself is. So, when we've seen it thrown about and like, Beyonce's in the Illuminati or whatever. There is a kind of a entertainment milieu that controls what we see symbolically, but the Illuminati has some very, very solid roots, and there are warnings in the founding fathers' letters to each other back and forth about the Bavarian Illuminati. And what was great is I was reading a letter between George Washington and a friend, and they literally say, "Hey, I was just reading this conspiracy book." I kid you not. That's the language. And they go into this whole thing about the Illuminati, and then the guy is not getting the reaction that he wants from Washington. And so he's like, I'm sorry if I offended you with my analysis of the Illuminati. And then Washington writes him this big thing back, like, "Oh, sorry, I was distracted. I was just, saving the country and everything. But yeah, I get what you're saying, and there's no question about it." I'm going to read those letters tonight.
Can't wait.
Along with Jefferson's letters warning of this Bavarian Illuminati. This is very important because what they're referring to is a group that has political engagement, but it has a spiritual engagement. And this is what's often missed when we deal with politics, which is you're not just looking at, I remember for a number of years, they were portraying the differences between the Democratic and the Republican Party as who wanted to increase Medicare premiums more, one or the other. And I think the most boring election of all time was the Obama-Romney election, because it was literally like they were exactly the same and they had no differences. So what was the point? And it was very interesting when Trump came on the scene because, however you want to size up Trump's influence here, he blew apart that samey thing. And he brought in a number of contrasts and contradictions that got things going and open. And the efforts to put down that presidency were very interesting. And I think that's part of what we're seeing today with the raids on Bolton and others, that the raids on President Trump when he was out of office were extraordinary. And we have to reflect on this for a moment because they didn't do that to presidents. They just did not. Even Richard Nixon, who they knew was up to his neck in what they could use as crimes. Of course, on some level, all of them are because of the milieu that they're in. They didn't do that with Nixon. They let him get pardoned off by Ford. And the fact that they changed all the rules in order to get Trump, and then the civil cases and all the rest. Yesterday they let go of the New York civil case for $500 million. This is all the legal warfare that they brought to bear. And now there's like some weird payback thing going on from the Trump administration. And I don't know if that effort should go so far. What I would recommend actually is they take the ball and run with it because of the opposition that they have. They have a very small window between here and the elections in 2026 where they're in a much more fragile state. People have been talking about how, well, the Democrats are over and the Republicans have everything. They have a slim 3-seat majority in Congress. And that's in the House. So that House can flip very quickly, and then you just have the Senate, all kinds of problems there. So while you have it, use it, and not just a bunch of executive orders. That would be my kind of best advice for the Trump administration. That's my free moment of candidate administration advice. I will also say that they've been sending out J.D. Vance a lot to, comment on things like Zelensky and all the rest. And instead of using his very articulate mind, they've been having him say very glib answers like, "Oh, I was just waiting for him to step out of line," or, or calling other leaders jerks or something like that. This is not his role. That's much more of a Trump thing that fits his character, his tone. J.D. Vance is much more of the honor student kind of guy. And even though he has the hillbilly background and all that stuff, this is a real miscast.
It's misbranding.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And for me, when I look at that, what I'm thinking is that, Vance has a role there. And if they make him just into a Trump mini-me, it's going to be a disaster because that's not really what he's about. Nor should it be something we put forward. It's funny because the Democrats are trying to do this with Gavin Newsom. and he's like, I'll knock their block off, and it's like, you just picture this guy with his arguing with his hairdresser about exactly how to get his hair right. Newsom, for me, is the guy that they're going to put out in 2028. And if anything, they need to build up Vance as a complete and utter difference for that. And then what they're trying to say in the background is they're trying to strike a deal to get Elon Musk back on board. But I realized an incredible contrast in history, that there's a kind of a tie over here, which is going back to the 1960 election and the presence of Frank Sinatra in the middle of it. And Sinatra does come up tonight because, believe it or not, he was in a NASA commercial with Willie Nelson.
Wait,
I
what are
kid
you
you
talking
not.
about?
Frank Sinatra. And Sinatra, it's very interesting because in the 60 election, he's such a vital and important force. He is trying to help Kennedy close the gap with Nixon and all of these different connections that they have on the organized crime side. And of course, Nixon has all of his organized crime people out there canvassing and trying to do that. So it's a very tight situation. And they're using everything that they can work at that point. And what's happening, very interesting in that election, is they even use Sinatra to do the Kennedy campaign song. But as soon as they get in, it becomes very obvious that he's a liability. And he's also urging them to release certain members of the mob or pull the charges from them and all the rest. So they quickly, within 6 months, realize, oh, right after the inauguration, this guy's out. And it reminds me of the Musk thing, because Musk came in and he was so helpful in Pennsylvania. He was so helpful in the 2024 election with Trump. But really, when you came right down to it, he became an excess liability. And when Trump was trying to do things and Musk was always there, it started to be that he was dragging Trump down. And that's a very interesting contrast there. Of course, Musk has been, promoting his whole Imagine software there. And, he's been putting up all these images of these anime chicks who are scantily clad or
It's
whatever. I mean, there has to be some way for this guy to get serious on the world stage. I don't know what it is, but that's not.
It's that he is who he is. He's a middle-aged man. He's not going to change at this point.
I think somebody, should definitely take the iPhone away from him. But what we're looking at, very interestingly, with some of the comments that took place over the past few weeks on the UFO side, is now there's a UFO file hearing set for September 9th.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's coming up in about 3 weeks. And, they have the whole.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's 9/9, and then 2025, isn't it?
Yeah,
So
very interesting.
That is damn interesting.
Well, what's interesting to me is they had all summer to do it. They did nothing. The task force and that whole piece that Luna was running did absolutely nothing. They had some very, very milquetoast Kennedy hearings. And I think they could, and she has the interest to do it, but it hasn't been working out. And so one of the wonderful things that she did is she called out the fact that they were setting up these SCIF meetings and they were going to do these great things. And that as soon as they arranged for the SCIF, which is what all these whistleblowers asked for, and Mellon was saying, oh, if you could only get them in the SCIF, and Lou Elizondo and all these people. And Elizondo, I think they're willing to cut bait on at this point. But
right, he has his new bar to
oh
attend
God,
to, right?
Unbelievable. That's what the CIA does. They're like, you're a liability. We'll go open a bar.
Seeing Sights, by the way, says 999 is 666 upside down. Reminding
really
us all,
true.
thank you.
9 is that's the Enneagram number, though. So I don't know. It's how you use it. I thought this was interesting. So Luna, when she was on, she went on Joe Rogan's show. It was unusual because she was using a lot of X-series themes, and I thought the conversation could have gone to certain places, and then she spilled out and was like, oh yeah, aliens are interdimensional angels or demons or something. I mean, this was really, this is not the way that you get to the bottom of the UFO thing. But I think what they're trying to do is pull in this whole Christian fear thing around the alien part. which is underestimating people who are Christians. And this is a big problem I think that they're trying to do. And I see Burleson's trying to do it as well. And Burleson is becoming this weird point man for anything. It's almost like he's going to start his new Art Bell Part 2 podcast. So Burleson, is he going to talk about Sasquatch next? I mean, this is getting strange in Congress. And so what we have, though, is Luna was getting tired of them developing symptoms of flu all of a sudden every time they were scheduled to go into the skiff. And so she started to call it skiff flu, which I think is a good term. And so when she sent that across, Elizondo and his crazy lawyer went online and they said all these weird things, your mama and all that kind of stuff. And, because they're so intelligent, there's something demented when you get into that level of doing intelligence work. I don't know what it is, but I've seen it before. And he in particular goes into this whole infantile mode. But what she wrote after hearing this was, I just talked to Comer regarding issuing subpoenas for certain individuals that developed skiff flu or had other things come up when we asked them to come in to divulge information to Congress, which is reasonable. What I love about this job is flushing out the truth tellers from those that are trying to sell books and potentially being disingenuous in an effort to undermine our investigations. See you in the skiff. Well, that is a pretty heavy blowback to Mr. Elizondo and the Mellon campiness. But I have a feeling, again, that it is Mellon that is particularly inserting Elizondo in a bad light right now on purpose, because he has a replacement handy. And this is where they're going with that. So, and then Luna also, when she was doing her whole routine, she mentioned that she had had a UFO encounter of her own. Well, this is what I always ask, which is, you have all these Congress people and senators, and they're like, let's talk about UFOs. It's like, what do you have anything to do with UFOs? What have you heard about this? Have you heard there's like some incredible money train in the background coming in? Well, what she had to say was talking about this shocking UFO encounter. And when she worked, when she was in the Air Force, they had this whole thing. Well, at least there's that one answer from one person about why they're into the UFO subject and in Congress and why it's become such a major thing on their behalf. The other thing I thought that was noteworthy before we dive full-fledged into the episode, and it's going to be such a deep dive that you're going to want to take a deep breath and focus, because this one's going to take us into all kinds of interesting territory. We've got our friend, the CEO of Palantir, Alex Karp, and he made this very interesting quote, which is, it was inevitable that we were going to go into a three-front war with Russia, China, and Iran. In other words, it's a lock.
Wow. When was this?
So, well, this just came out August 2nd, but I find this interesting. And Palantir, again, weirder and weirder, because when we get into what's happening with Palantir and the whole bit that we have around Teal and the predictive aspects, the surveillance aspects, the Minority Report, crime prediction aspects, and all the rest, it's starting to get to be, almost an arrogance thing on the technology side. And if anything, they may have to have congressional hearings to rein those people in in terms of their predictive games and the influence that they're having. That is the lobbying for war, the lobbying for this kind of anti-constitutional approach to surveillance. And that's something that I think that Trump has turned a little bit of a wink or a blind eye to, because they supported him so much going in to the White House this round, because inevitably, they had to double down on their bets. But it is something that I think after this first year into his term, it's something the president is going to want to look at. So I wanted to mention this. There's the shot of Sinatra and Willie Nelson getting directed by Mickey Dolenz in a 1988 NASA commercial. And they're like, the space program is groovy, baby. Like, me and Willie are going into space. So
Did you post this on X later?
I did. I
Okay.
actually did. Yeah. It is up there on our X. It's Dark Journalist, and you you won't miss it. And there's a connected to it is a 45-second minute commercial about them talking about going into space and how groovy it is. But that shows something I think very special, which is, NASA was already getting into this entertainment zone. But the fact that they grabbed people like Sinatra, I thought, again, I was doing a big review on The Manchurian Candidate and just how important that film is from a number of different levels, and how Sinatra was so hardcore behind having it made, and then became, when it had distribution issues, bought it. And then after the Kennedy assassination, took it off the market for 15 years. And then it didn't get a proper showing until 20 years later. So, and there's something very, very interesting. It's like too much information directly out of that Fonda novel. One of the other figures who comes up in a major way tonight is General Walker. And the more we go into General Walker in relation to the deep event of the Kennedy assassination, the more we learn that the web of influences around Walker and the fact that they used him as this ploy after, getting rid of the president and then getting rid of the assassin, so that they could say, oh, look, he was also, Oswald was also behind trying to kill Walker, as a sort of a template set up to show, see what a psychopath he was. But it's very interesting because I was going through those Kennedy files again, and a very interesting one came out. Let's see what you think of this. This is from the Church Committee testimony that he gave in 1975. Now, it's worthwhile noting that a year later, he will get arrested in a men's room for supposedly making, kind of illicit gestures to someone in there who was an undercover agent. So it was like some kind of a sting operation where they get him. And then oddly enough, he pays the $750 fine, and that's the end of it. But nonetheless, I thought it was interesting, given that he had given this testimony just a year earlier. Listen to this. Dear Senator Church, and this is from General Walker. The Warren Commission found and concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald attempted to assassinate the undersigned at his home at 9 p.m. on April 10th, 1963. Of course, he's the undersigned. The initial and immediate investigations at the time of the incident reported 2 men at my home, one with a gun, seen by an eyewitness, neighbor. Within days, I was informed by a lieutenant on the Dallas City Police Force that Oswald was in custody by 12 that night for question. He was released on higher authority than that in Dallas. There were 2 men, not a, quote, lonely loner. Please inform me if the CIA was involved in this attempted assassination. That's quite a remarkable document for a number of reasons. One, in the historical record, none of the authorities know that Oswald was involved in the attempted assassination of Walker until after the Kennedy assassination. But this is April 10th, and he's saying that at midnight on April 10th, 1963, they grabbed Oswald and brought him in for the attempt on Walker and then released him because of higher orders. Now,
and higher orders would come from?
Well, they would have to come either from the Justice Department or the CIA or the FBI, whatever it would happen to be, but it's certainly not local control.
Right. And why would they do that?
Yeah, that's the question that it raises, but it raises another question, which is, in all my investigations, and anyone who's really good on the Kennedy assassination knows that Oswald wasn't shooting at General Walker. There's just no evidence for it. Zip. One of the things that they try to do was say, oh, hey, the bullet was the same or whatever. But Walker was so convinced that they were feeding him a load of bull that he went and checked the fragments himself. And he said, oh, it doesn't have anything to do with the type of rifle that they said that Oswald had, which we don't even think that he had that rifle, the Mannlicher Carcano. So this is a very interesting setup, because one of the things that was going on in the background with Walker is they were trying to put him out there at the time as a very right-wing candidate for president. In fact, he had been a candidate for governor in Texas in the 1960 election. And John Connally beat him, but he polled a substantial number, oddly enough, during the primaries. So there was this whole thing that this guy is going to be one of those characters, kind of like, Dr. Strangelove kind of thing, where you get this really right-wing general and he's going to take over and all the rest. But he was speaking to a large part of the population. And in fact, during the early part of the Kennedy administration, Robert Kennedy will have him put in jail for speaking to these cadets that we had stationed in West Germany and, saying kind of anti-administration things. And they let him out, after, I think, a week or something. But here he is on the record, and you don't hear about this very much, saying that they had grabbed and arrested Oswald on April 10th for this. Meaning they already were probably trying to set Oswald up for these various things. But he got released because the designated culprit there couldn't be tainted too early until they really needed to lay this story out.
But they have a paper trail for later.
Right. Yeah, they could.
They're creating a legend.
They are creating a legend. What's interesting, though, is they don't have anything. So they never present that he was arrested, ever. They just say by word of mouth that, hey, you know what? It just so happened.
So there's no paper trail?
No.
There's no actual proof that they grabbed him?
No. April 10th? No. The police only arrested Oswald in New Orleans that summer.
Wait, so how does Walker find out about it? Who tells him?
Well, what he says there is pretty interesting in the letter itself. He says, I was informed by a lieutenant on the Dallas City Police Force that Oswald was in custody by 12 that night.
That's so weird.
So that's the night of the shooting. So he knows, he lives right there in Dallas, and he's a general. The police department's going to deal with him all the time. But he's on the record there. And then at the end of it, he says, please inform me if the CIA was involved in this attempted assassination. So we're interesting, right off the bat, we're in weird territory. But I'm going to show you how the people around this incident branch off. And it's very unusual because Roosevelt's son-in-law comes into the picture right around the same group that, when Walker is going out and doing these talks and things. And they have various names like the Constitution Party. And, they're using various titles. And there's a group that comes up during that period named the Liberty Lobby. That's where Peter Dale Scott's work is so fascinating on this. And I'm going to bring some of that in as we get into this here tonight, which is the special episode, Dark Journalist X Series 202, Illuminati Deep Events Secret Network. And continuity of government is included here, along with a trail going back, and this term Illuminati, and how that actually fits with what we're talking about, and the strange presence of clairvoyance. Clairvoyance in the middle of all of this. I want to remind you also, if you're new here especially, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. This is the best way for us to stay in touch, and it gets us around all the censorship that happens with us repeatedly on the social media networks and on YouTube and everything else. And, they're great anyway, but it's much better with the newsletter. And in that newsletter, you'll find out about the exciting episodes we have coming up for you, X series episodes that'll blow your mind, and interviews like you wouldn't believe. We have a great interview lineup. We just had this fantastic interview with Gigi Young on CERN. Forget it. That thing is off the charts and explosive. The feedback on that is dramatic, and Gigi's work is great as ever. But we have those coming up. The Dark Journalist docuseries, which is Pyramid X, that whole piece is there. And of course, JFK and the UFO file. All of those and the docuseries are for you, but you'll find out about them first if you're on that newsletter list. So go to darkjournalist.com and make sure that you're there and stand up and be counted. I wanted to show you something unusual. And it's not to get too into the details around the Kennedy case, but I want to point out something about how every time you go into that case, something else comes up glaring that is just inconsistent. And it shows the guiding hands of very, very deep agencies manipulating even the smallest minutia on the surface. So I just mentioned the arrest of Oswald in New Orleans in the summer, and that was for fighting with these Cubans that he was trying to infiltrate and say, hey, I'm an ex-Marine. I can help you, blow up bridges against Castro. And then they see him, and he's outside of Guy Bannister's office giving out pro, trying to get rid of Castro. And so they see him, and they're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? You're pro Castro? And they start to fight with him. This is the fight thing, and they get on the news because of that. So this whole thing could have been staged. But there he is, and the FBI gets called in, and they go in and talk to him, and then they destroy their own notes after that. And then Dutz Murrett, who is related to Oswald, he's Marguerite's brother. And what happens...
Brother-in-law.
Brother-in-law.
Right.
And what happens is Murrett bails him out. So he was going to spend 10 days in jail there. But Dutz Murrett is part of, like a bookie network. He's part of a kind of a mafia thing. And you don't hear enough about how that works around Oswald. You always hear, the mafia was involved in the Kennedy assassination and all the rest. But the low-level setting up of people through the Central Intelligence Agency using organized crime is very important to notice. One of the things that I saw, because I saw different close-ups of the picture, of the arrest picture, and it's very clear there that during the arrest, the height is listed as 5'8". There, you can just see he's right over that 5'8" line. And when you look at the funeral setup of the person that's measured in that grave is 5'11". And there's always been that thing about the Oswald's doubles. We've gone into it, and Lee Harvey and Harvey Lee and all the rest. But how very unusual is it on record just to have this 3-inch difference between one of the most important figures and mysteries in history? It doesn't add up.
Maybe it's a good moment to review the whole skull difference where they
Oh yeah, Paul Grudy.
Yeah.
I will say this about Paul Grudy, which is he was a funeral, the guy who handled the funeral of Oswald, and he had a fantastic reputation there. And when people came to him, the Secret Service themselves said, did you find these scars on Oswald's wrist? Because, he was supposed to have committed suicide, had a suicide attempt when he went to Russia. And he said, well, no, I didn't see anything like that. And they asked him other questions, like, did he have a scar on his ear where he had this whole operation when he was 6? And, he didn't remember any of it. And so they said to him, we just don't know who you're working on here. It doesn't add up with the facts that we have. So those were Secret Service people who came to him and asked those questions. Later, the whole thing about, is that Oswald in the grave? And a lot of people, for some reason, don't know this story.
Mm-hmm.
But Marina, after hearing so much of this, said, let's exhume the body because I want to make sure that's Lee in there. And they did. There was a whole thing about it, is that really him down there? And Grudy got called in to confirm it, and he thought it was weird right off the bat because they had the body and the head separated and all the rest. And also, he recognized somebody had broken into the coffin. And then when he was looking at the head, he said, where's the part of the skull where we did the autopsy? Because you have to do the autopsy. It was law in Texas at that point. And the skull that they showed him didn't have that. So whoever's... What's interesting is, so he wasn't going to confirm any of it. So 3 months later, they get this doctor to confirm it was the same person. And the way they could do it was through the teeth. And what he concluded as the funeral director was just that, they replaced the head so somebody would find the right head there. And all that, I think, is rather, this is part of what you get whenever you get around the Kennedy assassination. You are dealing with multiple deep agencies working in the background. And the height difference thing there was pretty classic. And it's funny because when I was looking at Peter Dale's work, going through the Oswald files, he's showing how they're constantly switching the names around to Lee Henry, Harvey Lee, in the documents from the State Department, from his military records and all the rest. And they're obfuscating over and over again, including his address. And then one of the most fascinating things in the middle of all that was that Oswald's mother was supposedly at this address in Waco, Texas. And what they found out was the address and the phone number were just for the Fort Worth Telegram, which was the newspaper, the big newspaper down there at the time, and that she wasn't at any of those addresses, but she was getting and receiving mail back and forth with the military directly through the newspaper. So, the newspaper had all kinds of interesting backgrounds. It was basically the guy who founded it was connected to the Air Force, and he was like a PR relations person for the Air Force. So the entire operation of the newspaper was kind of an intelligence operation. There's Marguerite Oswald in the middle of it giving out all these phony addresses. So I did find that very interesting. And I thought to myself, they knew with the work that they were having Oswald do that someone might kind of turn on his family, and they didn't want to create a situation. So they literally gave her these covers. And that's something that's not really on the record. It does show up in the work of people like Dick Russell and Peter Dale Scott. It's very important to understand how they manipulate the record, and that comes into what we're going to talk about next, which is our friend Dahl, and Dahl, the son-in-law of FDR. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Deep tonight into X Series episode 202, the Illuminati Deep Events Secret Network. We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of tonight's program. What else you got out there?
Well, I'm just going to ask you, because you brought up the story of the flight that was diverted, that picked up. Okay, so there's another Oswald who got let off at Roswell.
Yes.
Right.
Oh yeah.
So what's your interpretation of all this data?
Oh, well, they had the doubles ready at the theater. So they had one guy pulled out the back and one guy pulled out the front. And they needed that because whatever it was that they were going to do, they needed the person who was going to assassinate Tippit. They needed people to see someone who looked like Oswald. So that's what I think they were doing there. That's why they had them both at the theater. And then in the middle of the confusion, they can just take their guy off. The story of Robert Vinson, who was a technical sergeant at, he actually worked for NORAD, and he had an incredible story of them taking him on one of those Janet Area 51 flights after he'd had this big meeting in Washington, D.C., and them flying. And then at about 12:29, they announce on the radio, we are changing our schedule here because the president has been killed. And then they drop off at Trinity River. So they were headed to Colorado and NORAD. And they're at Trinity River outside of Dallas. And he sees these guys get on who are in construction clothes. And one of them is Oswald. The other one is a Cuban guy. They don't say anything to him. And then the pilot takes off. They go and sit up front. And then when the plane lands, they run off. And the pilot runs off. They just take off. They don't say anything to him. And so he goes, they're in some kind of a, air hangar, and he goes up, and there's an MP with a little light, thank God. And he goes up to him and he says, what's going on? And he says, I need to get back to NORAD. And he said, well, you're at Roswell Air Force Base. So they flew the double to Roswell. And when we get into the things that we've unearthed with Roswell Reignited, which is another series that we're doing, it shows the connection and the interconnection of these things that is unmistakable. So in Roswell Reignited, we show that the same deputy sheriff who goes in and finds the Oswald rifle will run all the things for the Foster Ranch Roswell people and become their CEO in a very short time. Even though the Roswell incident takes place in 47, the assassination in 63, it's the same person as this interface in the middle of these events. And so it opens up a series of things. But, you can't, as far as reality goes, you can't make that up. Roswell is obviously a major focus of this X-Protect secret network. And their Air Force base there, which was Walker Air Force Base, there's a great many secrets that are operated out of there. As a matter of fact, when they made the movie 7 Days in May, they have it behind the COG general who's taking over on the map.
Oh, wow.
So when you think about John Frankenheimer and how clued in he was and how Kennedy was trying to get him to make this movie, then these things start to open up a little bit.
It's an Easter egg.
Well, it's an Easter egg. And what's also interesting is guess who shows up in the middle, in the heart of this investigation around these unusual figures related to the deep state, like Roosevelt's son-in-law and the whole thing around Oswald and all the rest of it. It's Philip Corso.
Mm-hmm.
And Corso, we did an episode featuring Corso about 3 weeks ago. Corso's always very interesting character, but what the UFO crowd missed, and it's a terrible thing that they missed it. That was 1998 or whatever. I guess that's the excuse, but it only got worse later. Is they were like, oh, well, he's not telling the truth or whatever. This guy was not only in the heart of World War II and had the backlog of a very traceable record into all kinds of secret operations during the Cold War, that his bona fides are unmistakable. So, and then the misapprehension, I think, of his information, just looking for the very straight ahead, was there a dead alien thing? And that is part of the story. So it's part of the sensationalism around it. But I'll tell you what's fascinating is we're going to find in the middle of that Liberty Lobby, General Walker milieu that we're discussing tonight, that shadowy network, Corso's right in the heart, operating with all of them, as is FDR's former son-in-law. So you can see we're getting into deep territory right off the bat. And I'm going to show you how that slipped ahead into the following decades. And the same kind of pattern continued up. And then, what else you got?
Okay, Conrad wants some clarification. Why does DJ think it was the double on the plane that got dropped off at Roswell and not the actual Oswald? They had a lot invested in Oswald just to take him out versus what they had invested in the doubles. Also, it would make more sense if the Oswald that was in the casket was taller than the Oswald that was arrested, and they went through the bother of switching the skulls. That is the one that got killed, the one that was in the casket, at least, is not the original Oswald, is a double. And they switched the skull. Remember, they mentioned this, that was the whole point.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, see, there's so many stories about Oswald. Here's what shows you how our history can't be trusted the way that it's laid out. Anyone who's a solid researcher knows that Oswald, the same guy who's growing up in New York, there's also an Oswald growing up in Beauregard, Texas, and there's also an Oswald going to high school and stuff in New Orleans. So they have multiple versions of him way before the Kennedy assassination. Now, are some of those exaggerated, in the crisscross of it? Some of them are undeniable. One of the most undeniable pieces, I think, that I've ever run across was a family that contacted the Warren Commission, after the assassination and said, we lived there in Stanley, North Dakota, and Oswald lived next door to us for a year and a half with his mother, who, was this great-looking Russian woman, which is hilarious because, Oswald's mother was a lot of things, but she's
great-looking, one of them.
And but they have a whole history of it. As a matter of fact, they go through all these stories about that Oswald and how he said he had just come from New York, which he had just been in New York because Oswald had a half brother there, John Pick, who was a lot older. And Oswald, during part of that period was in trouble with juvenile authorities and stuff. So there's a record of him in these schools in New York City. And then the family goes back to the West. So while he's there in North Dakota, it's interesting because Marguerite is living next door and they're in a trailer near these houses, and the trailers are for these various oil workers. So what would happen is the family would go there, the father would go work on the oil rig somewhere, and they'd have to live and wait for the father to come back. And Oswald lived in one of these, and he would say to these guys, oh yeah, my father is away working on an oil rig while he's living there with his mother. And they staged this incident at the library where he stole, or he actually became so upset that he was looking for this Karl Marx book, The Manifesto of Communism. And he's supposed to be around 14 here, and he flips out at the librarian, and they call the police because he's a security problem, how much he's flipping out. So there's some kind of trail there and a story that they remember about this kid who was into communism, you know? And so whatever they were doing there in North Dakota, they decided, let's not do it. And it's very interesting because if you go and you look at the original notes of him getting interviewed by an American news person when he lands in the Soviet Union, you will see in her original notes, it says Oswald spent time in New York and North Dakota. So it's, he's in North Dakota. They don't ever want to talk about that, just like they don't want to talk about the fact that he was arrested during the Walker incident. So you're getting, these reflections through a glass darkly. And the question is why? And why does it almost take on a sort of mystical glare at a certain point? Because the individuals that you're talking about are so manipulating the record that you're getting a reality that is completely constructed from the ground up. And that includes taking this guy who was, supposedly dirt poor and having him travel all over the world, having him be in the Soviet Union when no other American practically was there. I mean, there were maybe a half dozen Americans in the Soviet Union at that period. So, it's an extraordinary, incredibly expansive life on secret bases in Japan, the Area 51 of Japan and all the rest of it. So the Oswald problem is the way that he's been portrayed by history and what you actually get when you look into it. And now, as I said, through the Joe and Nitty's records and other things that have come out, we now know, okay, the CIA was manipulating the image of this guy. And they waited 62 years just to tell you that. Can you imagine? And this is the nature of the problem. Let's see if we can go back a little bit into Dahl, Curtis Dahl, and see if he gives us some solutions around this, because very interestingly, he's right in the heart of these groups that we're talking about in that period of time who are around the Kennedy assassination. Of course, not to say that Curtis had anything to do with the assassination, but he is part of Liberty Lobby. He is being run as vice president on the Constitution Party. He is in this milieu, and a lot of the people that are in that milieu will surprise you. Some of the people in history like Strom Thurmond and others won't surprise you very much because he had run independently for president and things before. But some of the other ones will, including a very well-known author of the period and her strange predictions that are recorded by the FBI. We're going to get into that next. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Very strange indeed here tonight. This episode will keep you up at night wondering what on earth is this all about. And we have some very special quotes as well from Dick Russell's book, Peter Dale Scott's book, and Edgar Cayce book, and also from our friend Dr. Joseph Farrell as well. What else you got?
I'm trying to remember. Was it Strom Thurmond who wrote the original foreword to Philip Corso's book?
Yeah, I have that. I'm going to read that
Okay.
tonight. Yes.
Great.
In Corso, probably important for us. What I might do is read a couple of the Corso things, and then we'll get into Dahl.
Mhm.
That's how we'll do this. All right. So Colonel Corso wrote The Day After Roswell, which basically, in a nutshell, tells us during Roswell, they recovered all this technology, and then various agencies through the government worked in these various secret ways to exploit that technology. And that eventually it ended up in something called the Foreign Technology Office, which he was the head of. And he had to figure out how to seed it to industry, and claimed a number of miraculous things for this technology, including the fact that, it propelled our entire computer knowledge.
Right. It was like fiber optics, Kevlar, right?
So many
Okay.
things.
Mhm.
Yeah, he did that as well. Now, one of the things that people say about Corso is that, there's no way he could have done all these things. If you go into his background you're going to find him right in the thick of it. He's giving briefings to Eisenhower, briefings to Kennedy. He's a major player in the national security state. There's no question about it. Here's what he had to say about Roswell. The JFK assassination is the topic of conversation and how his conversations with Hoover changed. And then he brings up Roswell. I think this is a very tantalizing little piece here. Quote, the communists used McCarthy to give them good press and open up an area where they could work while the anti-communists were made to look like fools. I told this to Robert Kennedy, who as a young lawyer had been a member of Roy Cohn's investigative staff working for the McCarthy subcommittee and who had learned firsthand what it was like to be completely misled into self-destructive behavior. It was a mistake, he confided to me, that he would never make again. Unfortunately, his brother's enemies were his own, and he was misled into thinking that being president would allow him to settle the score. But in January of 1962, all that was on my mind was reestablishing a relationship with J. Edgar Hoover so that I could pursue my agenda while keeping a lookout for who might be dangerous out there in the academic community. Now I had something to bargain with for the information I wanted. Not only did I have the bits and pieces of the Roswell story that I knew Hoover wanted. He's putting the FBI squarely in the UFO file there, which is important. But only did I have the bits and pieces of the Roswell story, I also had the information about the domestic activities of the CIA. Hoover was more than interested in sharing information, and we continued to talk right through 1962 until I left the Army and went over to Senator Thurman's staff. According to Corso, the CIA tries to draft him in, and instead he goes to work for Senator Thurman. But let's stay with Hoover for a moment. My relationship with Hoover continued right through 1963, and in I'm going to back up. But in January 1962, all that was on my mind was reestablishing a relationship with J. Edgar Hoover. We continued to talk right until 1962. I left the Army and went over to Senator Thurman's staff. Our relationship continued right through 63, and in 64, when I was an investigator for Senator Russell on the Warren Commission, and Hoover was pursuing his own independent investigation into the president's assassination, he and I could only stare at one another again on either side of the great abyss of that crime. Stacked up against that enormity of what had happened, Hoover and I both understood that there are some battles you cannot win, so you leave them alone so you can fight another day. So he's mentioning Roswell there, and then he gets to the assassination, and then he gets to this kind of hopeless position when he's talking with Hoover in relation to the JFK assassination. He also reveals that Hoover's doing his own investigation outside of the Warren Commission. There were so many details buried in Army memos and maintained under layers of cover stories fabricated by military intelligence experts that he couldn't possibly know the truth. But like the good cop that he was, he took information wherever he could find it. I'm not sure whether J. Edgar Hoover ever really believed the Roswell story was true, an absolute conspiracy to cover up something else, or just a delusion that became mass hysteria. But he kept on searching for something that made sense. If the Army saw a threat to our society, then Hoover thought there was a threat, and whenever he could follow up a report of a sighting with a very discreet appearance by a pair of FBI agents to interview the witnesses and get away with it, he did. He was more than willing to share that information with me, and that was how I found out about some of the unpublicized cattle mutilation stories in the early 1960s. Now, cattle mutilation stories were brought to bear in the late 1970s by Linda Moulton Howe, and it's quite fascinating because she does this kind of sweeping documentary of it in 1980. But here he is talking about cattle mutilation stories coming in the early 60s from Hoover. So this is a very long-standing practice. That type of information out of Corso's work is fascinating. Here's my last quote on Corso, which I also think is revealing, because again, whenever he interfaces around JFK and the Roswell incident, he seems to be he's saying that there's something so huge between the two of them. Hidden beneath everything I did and at the center of my double life that no one knew about, and buried deep inside my job at the Pentagon, was a single file cabinet I had inherited because of my intelligence background. That file held the Army's deepest and most closely guarded secret, the Roswell files. That cache of debris and information of an Army retrieval team from the 509th Army Airfield pulled out of the wreckage of a flying disc that had crashed outside the town of Roswell in the New Mexico desert in the early morning darkness during the first week of July 1947. The Roswell file and the legacy of what happened in the hours and days after the crash, when the official government cover-up was put into place as the military tried to figure out what it was that had crashed and where it had come from and what its inhabitants' intentions were. A covert group was assembled under the leadership of the Director of Intelligence, Hillenkotter, to investigate the nature of flying saucers, to collect all information about encounters with these phenomena. This operation has been going on in one form or another for 50 years amidst complete and utter secrecy. Now, I think all of that is right on the nose, but check this out. If you go deep and you know your JFK assassination history very well, you'll be aware of a book called The Man Who Knew Too Much, which is by Dick Russell, who's a fascinating guy. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dick Russell, and The Man Who Knew Too Much was all about a spy named Richard Case Nagel, who shortly before the Kennedy assassination walked into a bank in San Antonio, shot into the ceiling, and waited for the police to come and get him. And when they came, they said, "What are you doing? You're not even robbing the bank." And he said, "I just want to be put in jail because I don't want to be out there when this bad thing goes down." And when they grab him, he has identification saying he's Lee Harvey Oswald and that he's himself. So the same way Oswald has Fidel information and he's himself, this guy, his backup is Oswald. And in fact, they do put him in prison. And during that whole period, the Kennedy assassination, he's in jail. So he got out. And his story is fascinating.
It's amazing because you don't need to go any further than that because that's on the record.
Yes.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Didn't say that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy. I mean, come on.
Absolutely. And in his mind, after a while, he wasn't even sure who it was that was hiring him to track, because he was tracking Oswald. And he said, "Wait a minute. At first I thought it was the Soviets, then it was the Americans. Who is this? What's this other thing?" And the people who were showing up were different all the time. So he wasn't even clear about who he was doing the spying for. So he was like, "I'm getting out completely." Now that book was quite fascinating. And when the Assassination Record Review Board came forward in the 1990s after the JFK movie, it's very interesting to note that Nagel died under mysterious circumstances, but not before he had given that whole story to Russell. Now, if you know anything about the Russell book, you know that if you want to stay in shape, all you have to do is buy it because it's about 900 pages. But there's a very fascinating chapter in there called Extremist Enclave. And he talks all about these different groups that are around the assassination milieu and around Walker, and they're in the picture. He can't quite figure out how they fit in, but nonetheless they show up. And of course, Charles Willoughby, who is the assistant to Douglas MacArthur, the great general, and who himself is German but changed his name, and who shows up in the research of people like Mae Brussel and others, is highly suspicious in terms of that whole fascist arm leaning into the assassination.
I think it's really interesting you chose the word Willoughby.
It is.
Right? It's
yes.
just
it's one of
such
those
an English
right.
kind of blue blood, like old money ancestry names.
He's just a wasp. He's a happy wasp. Here's a couple of interesting names that he throws out, but watch the bombshell right in the middle of this and keep that little quote from our friend Corso in mind. In the United States, both before and after his autumn European sojourn, Willoughby was in the midst of a steady correspondence with Colonel Thomas Fitchell, 30 years earlier, when Hitler first came to power in Germany, Pitchell had written the Fuhrer's close associate, Ernst Hoffenstengel, requesting that he, Pitchell, be appointed official American liaison to Hitler. In 1963, Pitchell was a Grand Chancellor of a mysterious sect called the Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem, also known as the Shikini Knights. And the Pennsylvania town is what it was named after, where Pitchell was based.
Spell Shikini for everybody?
Yeah, it is Shikshiny. Now, I'm going to tell you there's a major tie-in with the UFO file in my own research with the Shikini Knights, which are an offshoot of the Knights of Malta. And there are a few offshoots and offshoots of offshoots, which lead me to believe that there's a splintering on purpose, so you can't ever grab this group and snuff them out, as it were, in their setup. I'm sure at this period they felt just fine about it. But if you go back even into the 1930s and 40s, there are groups exactly like this, and they are all split off, and there's some version of the Knights of Malta. Now, various people, around the conservative milieu, like William F. Buckley Jr. and other brilliant guys like that, were part of the Knights of Malta and proud of it. A lot of CIA people were. But just keep in mind, there's a number of groups to track in the middle of this, but I'm just going to give us a picture of how the Shikini Knights fit into this. I will also say that on the record, John Warner, of course, the fourth, who was the son of Senator Warner of Virginia, and he's an incredible, great guy, author, and we've done a number of interviews with him. But it was he who told me that there were elements in the Mellon family that were associated with the Shikini Knights, and that Chris Mellon, he felt confident, was associated with them. It's very interesting when you find out what I say next in relation to that. So try to keep those figures in your mind as we go. Shell's group claimed to be the legitimate Knights of Malta, Catholic order dating back to the Crusades during the French Revolution when Napoleon occupied Malta. The existing knights scattered. One group was reconstituted later under the sovereignty of the Vatican. Another sought sanctuary under Tsar Paul I in Russia, remaining there until the Russian Revolution in 1917, when they were resettled once more in the White Russian community in America and Europe. Many came from the sleepy Pennsylvania town of Shikini. Now, just remember, as we get into this story, there are figures, Ruth Paine, Michael Paine, George de Mohrenschildt. They're all in this white Russian community of right-wingers in Dallas. And in fact, it is Lee and Marina who land right in the middle of the Paine household, which is odd enough because, of course, supposedly Lee is a raving communist maniac, except that he worked for a big right-winger as soon as he came back. Okay, so I'm going to get right into the bombshell here. It is not clear from Willoughby's papers just how he happened to hook up with Pitchell. But in September 1963, he had become the Order's Secretary General. So he was the top man. As he wrote to Pitchell, "I shall be honored to be of service. I am familiar with the tradition and ethical purposes of your order." He said he anticipated contributing his specialized knowledge and experience in the field of intelligence, counterintelligence, and security surveillance. For a time, he even merged his Foreign Intelligence Digest into the Knight's own publication. On his autumn 1963 trip, he informed Pitchell that he would see about gaining recognition for the order in the Generalissimo Franco in Madrid. So, with the general. Now, Willoughby was in suspicious company, for the Shikini Knights had, as Armed Services Committee, that in 1963 read like a who's who of retired military men on the extremist fringe. Check this out. All these knights had been singled out for their brilliant and outstanding careers at the Soldiers of Christ, and advocates of a free world. Besides Willoughby, they included a number of other members of MacArthur's old team: Brigadier General Bonner Fellers, Lieutenant General Pedro del Valle, major figure, Marine General Lemuel Shepard, British Admiral Sir Barry Domville, jailed in England during World War II as a Nazi agent. He was also on the list. Get ready. So was Colonel Philip J. Corso, 20-year Army intelligence career man until his retirement in August 1963. In 1956, Corso had sought to reactivate 50 surviving garrisons of East European paramilitary units still hanging on in West Germany and tied to the Gehlen spy network.
Whoa.
And we all know General Gehlen was the foundational member that the American government was drawing on to build the CIA, and was their intelligence wing, in fact, in Europe.
Joseph says, ding, ding, ding.
Yeah, these are kind of feral facts here. So to kind of wind this around, let's see. He had been the Military Operations Coordinating Board's delegate to the CIA group planning the 1954 Guatemala.
Wow.
So Corso is so major, and here he is with these Shikini Knights, who also have in their milieu this son-in-law of FDR. So I could go deeper. There's more information here on Corso, but I think that gives us a hint that Corso was a much, much more important player than this kind of, time travel guy that people are like, oh, we don't know if he's telling the truth or not. Whatever it is, whatever Corso represents, goes there.
Right. He's written off as like a fantasist or something, a lightweight.
Yeah, and we've talked about why they did that.
Yeah.
We feel that because of the way that Corso presented himself, which is very, kind of, he had the grouchy exterior.
Yeah, he was very gruff.
Yeah, he was gruff, and he was not particularly engaging, but a lot of guys in intelligence are like that. And I think that, but from a PR standpoint, promoting this big story about the things he had done with his life, very, very unusual.
It's amazing that information was just hanging out there in this book.
It is. I'll tell you what's interesting is that if you get into what's going on with Corso, there's a weird piece that keeps kicking in, and it has to do with Corso, his close friend Gene Dixon, of course, the astrologer, who was the astrologer for Nixon, the psychic for, various presidents, including Reagan. And this very, very unusual piece. We've done a number of episodes on Gene Dixon, but Strom Thurmond is in the middle of that mix. And Strom Thurmond does the intro for Corso's book, as we mentioned. And it's quite fascinating because after they run the first copies, he flips out and says, you can't talk about the UFO file. What are you doing? And he says, take my name off that book. And they do. But first, the original intros go out. So we have to think about Thurman's position in the middle of all that. But remember this, that there's a theme here about getting some kind of presidential representation. Thurmond runs for president in 1948, just like Henry Wallace
you're saying
does.
the Shikini Knights, that they want a president in office to represent them.
There's a step inside there, because of course we also have them trying to run Walker, and then finally they try to run Dahl himself. And I need to go into Dahl so we understand the importance of that. But the fact that he was somebody who was the son-in-law of the president, Roosevelt in that case, I think it made him very attractive to this group as well. And if you read his books, all that stuff that you hear and that is reflected in the kind of like anti-Bilderberg, anti-New World Order, anti-One World Order, anti-One World Currency, this kind of thing that is so, entrenched in the independent media. There's so much of it. We understand you don't want a one world government. You don't want that centralization. You want constitutional representation, all the rest of it. His work is foundational. So I think all of these other people who put together, because he's writing this stuff in the 1960s, My guess is much of it is drawn directly from Dahl. And his book has a very interesting title indeed. And the name of the book is My Exploited Father-in-Law, FDR. Quite fascinating. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Woo! Deep tonight into X Series 202. This is the episode. We're going deep into Illuminati deep events and the secret network. History, continuity of government, future replacing the past. Funny I said that because Philip Dick gets a very interesting chance to replay history, and I'm going to get into his Man of the High Castle tonight. Of course, we're going to be taking your questions in the second part of tonight's program. It's great to have so many of you with us here tonight. And also, I want to remind you, if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com. Sign up for the newsletter. It's a free newsletter. It keeps us in touch. It gets around the censorship, which is heavy, and heavier still when they're trying to roll out the UFO hearings. They're really trying to keep the potent stuff down. So make sure you're on that newsletter list. And it's free. You'll get it once a week. It'll let you know about the exciting documentary series that we have coming up for you. Of course, JFK and the UFO File is the documentary series, Pyramid X, and The Craze in the Hot Zone. We're working on all three, and we have a great stellar team doing it. And of course, the exciting X Series episodes, mind-blowing stuff, interviews, it's all there. Live events, all coming up in your newsletter. So go to darkjournalist.com, stand up and be counted. What do you got?
Jim Aram says, before he passed away, Harold Malmgren suggested that James Jesus Angleton's father may have had a connection to the Knights of Malta.
That's true. He did. And he felt that the Knights of Malta were a good place to go on the UFO side. I had my own limited interactions with Malmgren, and I wish he had said more, but it's important that as somebody who was around in that period, that he was another person who confirmed, like some of the things that Douglas Caddy told me on this program, all about how JFK was eliminated over the UFO file, and the airspace part played a major role in it. Well, he was very, very comfortable, Malmgren, with that assertion, and he made it himself. Caddy, it's very interesting because over time, he becomes more and more vindicated, as you get more stuff about Watergate and all the rest of it. Again, here's the UFO community, just in a way like they missed Corso. There's a problem there. Very few people, especially now that we've lost Stanton Friedman. And, we need to know, when you get around the UFO field, you need to know the difference between pop-click podcasting stuff and real deep research, the real potent stuff. That is the difference. That's what makes the difference. And if you have a lot of the pop-click stuff, it's always going to be, looks like something on top, and then there's nothing. Just like people will go by, if you think about the TTSA, that was 7 years ago. Big nothing. People even invested in that company. So that's how the CIA does it. They're there to kind of harvest the public. They're not trying to promote awareness among the public around these very, very deep issues. And the fact that they're trying to get into, fallen angels in the UFO file. Let me tell you, don't take the CIA's word for anything related to the UFO file. You're much better off with a civilian researcher, with people who've researched it in the past. Whatever they give you is going to be complete junk that is doctored up and made into a narrative. That's why all of the stories from those counterintelligence people are falling apart now, and people are sick of it. Now, I'm sure the CIA is getting ready to flim-flam them with some other jellyfish UFO thing, but people are seeing through that. So, when I was doing episodes with Gigi Young and we were exposing that whole thing, at the time, people were like, hey, why are you going against disclosure and things like that? Well, now you wasted 5 years of your life on a CIA propaganda routine. How does it feel? So what we need to do is we need to see it coming and say, it's too late to be waiting around for that stuff. There's a real course to follow when it comes to this type of work. And so when you get the field thing, when you think of a historical figure like Caddy, who was part of the Watergate, he's in All the President's Men. I mean, if he comes forward and says, the top man at the CIA told me in private that Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file, it's major. That's something that moves the actual conversation. And the fact that you had instead the dominant UFO people like Knapp or whatever promoting Elizondo, who was a CIA liar, tells you everything you need to know about what's wrong in that whole UFO field. And sometimes people say, well, yeah, the problem with the UFO thing is there's grifters in it or whatever. Look, I worked around corporate America, Wall Street. That's real money. Intelligence communities, real money. I mean, even the TTSA spent $50 million on their crappy TV show, and the CIA funded, I'm sure. What people do with books or whatever, that's not that, forget about that. Go to the much deeper thing. The deeper thing is the intelligence community is manipulating the entire space. You're always going to have, slick willies doing, fruity UFO stuff. That's not where the action is. The deeper part is that movement of disinformation and the promoters on the front of it, and the TMZification of the whole thing, the Corbell nonsense, that's the thing that promotes all the CIA people and allows the way in. And that's where the researchers have fallen down on the job. That's the nature of the problem.
You know what it's exactly like? I never thought about it before, but the Wolf of Wall Street, it's like junk bonds. Is they get you all hopeful and they harvest your energy and they harvest your money and you get nothing from it. You waste all this time, you waste your money, you waste your energy, you're left with nothing.
Yes.
They just vacuum it all up. And that's the whole point.
Yeah,
That's
it
how
is.
they think. They profit, you lose.
Yeah, and it's it's interesting too, because there's always been a certain amount of entertainment around any of these subjects, whether it's the deeper mystical stuff or UFOs, alternative research into history. There's always an entertainment side to it. That's not the surprising side. The surprising side is when the intelligence groups move in from one side and the marketing groups move in for the other, and all the real stuff is, there's nothing potent in the space, so much to a point where you look at the space and you're like, it's worthless, and there's a lot of that. And I'll tell you, the pop click aspect of the podcast world is making it that way, because their demand, the thing that they're under, is called peak metric. And I've exposed this on this show before, and I've heard about it from people who are very deep in the marketing world. And peak metric is what they've discovered. The ultimate thing that they need to show these advertisers is that they need this whole kind of number charade. And so what they do is the content quality goes less and less and less, and they have to produce more and more content. They need peak metric, which is no matter what it is that you have to put it out there. So you have a lot of these leading podcasts, and they say, well, I can't just do this one particular show. I have to do the show 5 times a week, or now I have to do it twice a day during 5 times a week, because they have to keep pushing more and more and more of it to stay in that top register. That's how you eliminate something. That's why, people will get sick of that. And the
So
actual
it's like flooding.
Yeah, flood the zone.
But that's amazing because it's the exact opposite of privacy.
Yes. Yeah.
It's diluting.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's the nature of the problem. I mentioned Philip K. Dick, and I can't leave you hanging on that.
Okay.
What else you got? Do you have something?
No, not so much. We can wait.
Fantastic. So Philip K. Dick is going to open us into this doll category, because it's a very unusual incident that I'm not too many people are sure or aware of, but that FDR, when he became the president, he was president-elect, he went down to Bimini, actually. I have photos of him down there. And then he comes back to Miami, and he's giving a speech, and the Chicago mayor decides to come down there and speak with him. And the Chicago mayor, oddly enough, is warned by a psychic not to sit with a major official like a president, or that something bad is going to happen, basically. This is well known. And as a matter of fact, the mayor, 2 days before, laughs about it in the Chicago newspaper. It says, well, this psychic has been warning me about this. Then he goes down and meets up with FDR in Florida. And actually, I have a picture. Hold on just one moment. Um, and I want to say this about the mayor himself is that there's something very strange in what happened, which is that the mayor is there. He's driving together with FDR. They get out of the car and somebody goes to shoot FDR. And then by accident, he shoots the mayor. Everybody jumps on him. And the FDR is fine, but other people get injured and the mayor dies. Now, oddly enough, the person who perpetrated the crime, and they do get the electric chair for it, there's a weird thing. There's a weird thing back there, which is there's someone else in his background, in his family background, who lived a few blocks from him, and they could not figure this out about how he was related. But instantly, I saw that fingerprint of X material right here, and it is the bygone era of psychics for hire. It's all about this very, very unusual psychic, and then his relative here, who's the one who does the shooting. Now, this takes place in 1933 when, like I said, Roosevelt is in, but he hasn't been sworn in yet. So he's in that very strange presidential elect position. Now, the clairvoyant is called the Great Zangara. And in 1909, he visited Baker, and he was living down there. And then the other Zangara, who is assassin, he comes along. He's the one who shoots. Now, it's very unusual because there's another very odd coincidence around the two. But when I saw that, I instantly thought to myself, Roosevelt was in quite a position there because a couple of years later, they tried to have a fascist coup to overthrow him. And then he can't say anything about it because the people that are involved are high-level generals and such. And it's also said that Prescott Bush was a part of that. Now, what's interesting to me is that when you get around the Kennedy assassination, we know that there's the Jean Dixon part about her predicting this assassination. But what we don't often hear about is this other woman who is a very famous novelist, and she has this incredible vision about Kennedy getting assassinated in August of 1963. And because she's a best-selling author named Taylor Caldwell, she approaches the Kennedys and says, this is what happened. And they give her the standard, like, thanks for telling us, we'll be careful kind of thing. And now, Taylor Caldwell is quite fascinating, and the FBI kept a massive file on this woman because she was involved with a number of very unusual groups. One of the groups that she was involved in is the very same group that is involved around that we were speaking about earlier, which is Liberty Lobby, and they are promoting, General Walker as president. And here she is on the board of policy, Taylor Caldwell herself, best-selling author, and she is one of the founding people on the board of policy of Liberty Lobby. I'm going to bring around how important that is. Go here.
There might be some people in the audience who don't know what Liberty Lobby is.
Well, I had mentioned it earlier, but fundamentally, it is a hyper-conservative group that's very concerned about communist takeover of America in that period of the 1950s and 60s. And it goes, by the way, even past 9/11. I think it's around till about 2004. And quite famously, they're involved in a lawsuit between Mark Lane and E. Howard Hunt. But I'll get into it.
Can I throw something in here?
Oh, yeah.
Retro Renovo says, I'm in Shikini. Family was here forever. Grandfather told me about hunting trips to cabins here where Nimitz and others attended. Always thought you made it up. Highly ranked Masons.
Oh, wow. It is beautiful, Shikini, I should say. And I have some pictures of Shikini that I'll show. It's a wonderful part of Pennsylvania. And the association is strictly with the group. But yeah, there's a lot of mystical things going on there. That's interesting. This is Taylor Caldwell. Now, this gets pretty wild. Taylor, like I said, makes this prediction. And remember, Taylor's a writer, and she's, they didn't know she was a clairvoyant, but she is. And remember, Gene Dixon also makes these frantic predictions just before the Kennedy assassination. Something bad is going to happen. And of course, she will go on to consult 5 different presidents. And early on, she also consulted FDR and told him exactly how much longer he had to live. So back there in the assassination files of JFK, you find a very unusual. You find all of these files related to the Kennedy assassination, an interested person. One of them is Mrs. Janet Reback. That file, which shows Mrs. Janet Reback, that's the actual name of Taylor Caldwell. And when you crack that open, you find, the FBI and the CIA had huge files on Taylor. Now, what I'm going to say about Taylor is that she took under her wing a very, very interesting person. His name was Jess Stern. He was a New York Times writer, and he also would end up writing the classic book about Edgar Cayce called The Sleeping Prophet. That's really the book that brings Cayce to the public some 20 years after he died. So there were, other books like There Is a River and things like that towards the end of Cayce's life. But really, it's, this makes Cayce popular with the 60s audience and Yoga Youth Reincarnation, the whole thing. Cayce suddenly fits right in with all of that, and it becomes an explosion of Cayce material, including his Atlantis material. And it is his exposure to that Atlantis material that will get him into, John Lennon's exposure to that Edgar Cayce material that will get him to buy lots in the Atlantic, thinking Atlantis is rising again. And then if you go into that story, you're going to find there are incredible high-level people. That's our whole Hot Zone series. And there are a number of people involved in the idea of Atlantis rising there somewhere in the Bahamas off the coast of Bimini. And like I said, we started this off, Bimini is the location that FDR was returning from when the attempted assassination takes place. Just kind of unusual, shall we say. What I wanted to say about Caldwell and what's so interesting is when she takes Stern under her wing, she tells him all these things about what's going to happen with his future and all the rest of it. And she discusses the fact that she had this thing about Kennedy and how it happened and what she saw on a television that wasn't on. She saw the whole assassination a couple of months beforehand. Now, what's interesting is classic to her era. There are a number of books about Taylor Caldwell that Jess Stern will write, like In Search of Taylor Caldwell and Romance of Atlantis. She becomes one of the highest selling authors in all of history with her incredible, and they make them into TV movies and everything else. Now, Caldwell, when she is doing this stuff with Stern, she's going through an incredible overview of Atlantis and everything else. But here she is sitting in the middle of Liberty Lobby. And the person that she's joined up with in Liberty Lobby is Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond has under his umbrella Gene Dixon. Gene Dixon, the psychic astrologer, as we've said. Then Philip Corso, Strom Thurmond has him as his special investigator. Here's Strom Thurmond writing his intro to Corso's book. Remember, this is the original before he pulled it. When I was first elected United States Senate in 1954, the United States and democratic Western governments were locked in a bitter and sometimes deadly Cold War with totalitarian communist governments that sought to expand their bankrupt ideology throughout the world. Through those who did not live during this era, they have a hard time picturing it. The 1950s and 60s were a period of our history when there was a very real need to be concerned about a communist, especially Soviet threat to our security and institutions. As a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, I took a lead role in seeking out those in and out of government who sought to muzzle military personnel who wanted to alert Americans to the threats we faced from our communist enemies and to speak out. Frankly, dangerous policies were going on in the United States in dealing with the Soviets and the Chinese. The distinguished officers and patriotic men such as Admiral Arleigh Burke and General Arthur Trudeau were essentially censored by their own government and had been a veteran. Arthur Trudeau had been a veteran of World War II and commissioned officer in the United States Army Reserve and a proponent of a strong and comprehensive military. I could not sit idly by and watch our military be undermined by people in government who were sympathetic to communism. And General Trudeau, of course, will be a major promoter of Philip Corso and will maneuver him around the planet doing different military installations and highly secret work. And sometimes it's suggested that the secret work he's doing around the UFO file is for Thurmond and that he's leaking it back to Thurmond. That's why when Corso leaves his posts in the military, he goes and works for Thurmond. And a proponent by a strong and comprehensive military. During this period, the Armed Services Committee held extensive hearings into this matter. It seemed an alien concept that in a nation that protects and cherishes free expression, the men who risked their lives to keep us free and best understood how we should confront under these circumstances, that I came to know Philip Corso, then a colonel in the United States Army, who was equally disturbed about the muzzling of our military and who shared my concern about the future of our military services. And then he goes on about how delicate national security is and the work of intelligence and all the rest. And all along, he's promoting our friend Corso as his main man. In 1963, when I learned of Colonel Corso's impending retirement from the Army, I thought that having a man with that background and experience on my staff would be of great benefit. So after offering him a position that promised nothing more than long hours and hard work on a modest salary, Philip Corso once again willingly went to work, serving and protecting the United States, this time as an aide in my office. There is no question that Philip Corso has led a full and adventurous life. I'm certain that he has many interesting stories to share with individuals interested in military history and the workings of our government. We should all be grateful that there are men and women like Colonel Corso. And then he goes on, with honor and sacrifice and all the rest. So you can see that our friend here is putting a great stamp of approval on Corso. But again, Thurmond, Taylor Caldwell, Gene Dixon, and Corso, it's a very interesting and strange bedfellow. Two psychics, a best-selling author, and a military man who's dealing with the UFO file in the middle of the Liberty Lobby, which is promoting General Walker for president, 1960. So you can see we're in weird territory right off the bat. And then when you get into the fact that Walker himself becomes mixed up in the affairs around proving that Oswald did it because he had also taken a shot at Walker, then you can see that the people who are pulling the levers and watching this from behind the scenes are seeing what assets they can use. But the clairvoyant aspect, I want you to keep an eye on that as we move forward in the middle of this, because it's going to get stranger still if I have the time to do it tonight. If not, we'll do another episode on it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep, deep, deep tonight into the great beyond. And I think what we're going to find ourselves looking at is a very strong case for these invisible hands that are massaging the perceptions of history. And in terms of what actually takes place, it's a very, very different story. And that's something that we're going to get from Dahl next. And I'll remind you, we're going to take your questions here in about 15 minutes. Before I go any further, you're up.
Humanarum again says, maybe Taylor Caldwell was an Atlantean reincarnate. Apparently, she wrote her fantasy novel, Romance of Atlantis, when she was 12.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's astonishing because when you look at her, she's kind of it's unusual. The people who understand writing and history know who she is, and she, even when she was on her deathbed, they were paying her like $4 million for her next book. She's just an extraordinary
Wow.
figure, and Jess Stern is interesting for a lot of reasons because she's predicting all these things about his future, and she also is telling him that he's going to write a book on Edgar Casey. Now, he's kind of cynical, and she gets into that too. This is the early 60s, 63, 64. He doesn't write the book until 1968. One of the things that he does in toying around with this idea of doing a book on Casey is he goes to the ARE in Virginia Beach, and he's hanging out there among the files, reading the different things that Casey has said. And in one of the readings that he looks at, it says, who's going to bring this work to the public? And Casey says there'll be a variety of things, and, keep putting the work out and all the rest. But they say, is there any advice you can give us about who's going to help us do this? And he mentions someone, and he says, says their name like Williams, Chicago. And then he says Stern, New York. And of course, Jess Stern is the author. And what's fascinating is this is a very interesting trail. So the woman who predicted to the mayor of Chicago that he was going to be shot if he drove in the car with Roosevelt in that perilous 1933 day is still around in the 60s, and she gets in touch with Stern, and she hears he's working on a book about Edgar Casey, and she says, you know what? I'm getting messages from Edgar Casey, and he wants you to do the book, and he wants you to really focus. He kind of gives him this impetus, and he gives this explanation, great speech that he gives at the ARA about how he wrote the book, and he said, usually it'd take me a year to write a book. I wrote Casey's book in 3 weeks. So I felt like something was helping me along. Well, this psychic comes to him and says, Casey wants you to call it the Sleeping Prophet. Well, the Sleeping Prophet is what Casey would become known as in the middle of all this. And we need to keep that in mind too. There's some other factor that's going on, and it comes up. This other factor comes up again tonight in a very spectacular way. And however you want to look at that, is fine. But let's face it, Stern and his association with Caldwell, and then the psychic giving him the heads up on the Sleeping Prophet, and then him going to Virginia Beach and finding the reading, predicting that he's going to write the book, and then he writes it and it's a bestseller. So sometimes you wonder about the strands and the threads of how these things work. And in Stern's case, he was a hard-nosed, straight-up journalist type guy. So this was not somebody, who was given to flights of cosmic fantasy. And yet there he was right in the heart of all of it. And his books from there on out would be all about these different topics. And he would, in fact, write a book with Taylor Caldwell. I want to say another thing about Caldwell. She will also be in the CIA and FBI records for, again, saying this time it's not a prediction, but she's saying that she's hearing that something big is going to go down on June 4th, 1968, and that she's worried about an assassination and that strange people have approached her and all the rest of it. I wonder, just as a kind of an overview thing with somebody like Gene Dixon, with somebody like Taylor Caldwell, because they were around these forces like Liberty Lobby and the Shikini Knights and all the rest, if maybe at times they weren't hearing threads about what these people were up to potentially, and had a way of putting that material out by saying, oh, it's a prediction, make sure this guy is safe. It makes you wonder, as does the close relationship between Gene Dixon and J. Edgar Hoover. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 202 Illuminati _ Deep Events Secret Network. Doll it is. Doll is next. What do you got?
Humanera, have there been any JFK researchers with psychic abilities who have attempted to remote view the assassination that you know of?
Nothing satisfactory, I have to say. And what I will say is I think that it's wide open for that kind work, but I think that, you know, it is an incredible, um, whoever did it would have to be an all-star, put it to you that way. Okay, Dahl, the son-in-law of FDR, wrote a fascinating book about FDR, about how FDR was manipulated. Ended up 8 years later divorcing FDR's daughter. A little bit familiar with him. He went to Princeton and he was one of the best stock traders on Wall Street. And he had at his fingertips, when he got into the good graces of his father-in-law, all of the incredible people on the FDR side, like Morgenthau and others, who really could give him the heads up on what that Wall Street world was all about. Some of his great recollections about Joseph Kennedy, the father of John Kennedy, on Wall Street, and the incredible sharkish nature of Joe Kennedy, and how Joe Kennedy was so smart doing things that were actually technically legal but were just outrageous. One of the things that he did is when he wanted to short sell a stock or have it crash or whatever, he would have people who were set up around the country from different mortgage houses and brokerage houses calling in the call or the put to either bring the stock up or bring it down. And because it was coming in from these different places, the stalkers, the people who were doing the stock trades on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange were saying, oh, people in Texas know, people in Chicago know, it must be something. This thing's going down, this thing's going up. And that's how Kennedy was well positioned to manipulate the stock market. It's very interesting, too, because Joe, I think, utilized this in business in a number of different ways. But by the time the crash, the Great Depression happened, something happened with Joe, which is, I think he realized, and he wrote essays about how the entire country was going to go into revolution unless we figured out how to make it a fair exchange all around. And that's where the great Kennedy ethic of, the kind of fair deal aspect, which comes out of the Roosevelt thing, but it's more about a balanced society, not a government controlled welfare safety net. That's a different thing. But having that idea that the people at the top need to be conscious of that balance between capital and labor. And so he put and instilled his children with these incredible ideals. But there's no question that Joe himself was, Dahl is telling us right off the bat what a hardcore factor is. Here's a little bit on the history of Dahl. Curtis Dahl is most well known in recent times for his book, My Exploited Father-in-Law, in which he speaks of his ex-father-in-law and his relationship with, as he saw them, the corrupt power of the banking elite of the time. In reference to the Great Depression of the 1930s, he states, actually, it was the calculated shearing of the public by the world money powers. Boy, is that a way to go. And it was triggered, actually, it was the calculated shearing of the public by the world money powers triggered by the planned sudden shortage of supply of call money in the New York money market. See, we need to understand that when they're trying to switch us to another form of currency, when they're pushing the whole, stable coin and these digital currencies and things, these are the same groups over and over again. The same groups that get us into war, the same groups that manipulate treasury, the same groups that manipulate divisions of society. And until you deal with that essential problem and unmask it through the layers of media and intelligence agencies and things, you're going to have it continual. But it's very important to understand that the people in our background in America went through these things. They went through World War II. They went through the Great Depression. We have that history, and it's kind of a, there's a DNA to the understanding about it in terms of being manipulated. They understood it then. They couldn't do as much about it as we can do now. And also they showed incredible strength getting through it. So I think we need to keep that in mind with the current challenges and with the world rebalancing and them trying to do this AI circus. and the technology manipulations and things and the political divisions, we need to remember we've seen these things, we have that history, and the more we grasp history, the better we can face the future. And doing it together in this fashion, instead of being overwhelmed by the news and having the attention span of a mosquito with these 30-second stories or a post on Twitter or something, there's a way to do this in a deeper fashion, in a more potent fashion. I think that's going to be every bit as valuable as storing gold or whatever it happens to be. I would never say storing Bitcoin, that's for sure. But I think it's important to think of that potency, that knowledge, the kind of investment, and to remember that history. But on to Dahl we go. Dahl's short memoir adds little to the history of the New Deal and skips over his relationship with Anna, Eleanor Roosevelt's, and Anna's correspondence reveal that they loathed Dahl, who admitted to being on acerbic terms with Lewis Howe and other FDR advisors. The title, My Exploited Father-in-Law, refers to Dahl's belief that sinister forces, represented in part by Bernard Baruch, Louis Brandeis, Felix Frankfurter, and Henry Morgenthau, manipulated FDR in the service of a godless dictatorship of the one money, one world superstate. Why does that sound familiar? Dahl became convinced that an evil global conspiracy, which he traced back to the Illuminati, that's where we're going next, secretly controlled history for its own enrichment. He wrote, I have departed and depicted the Goliath here. I have fashioned a stone for Goliath, as it were. Behold, the Federal Reserve and its shadowy new international counterparts, CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, Prince Bernhard's far-flung Bilderberg Group, and lastly, their discredited stooge, the self-described United Nations. Very interesting because this would become the whole line of so many people at the foundations of alternative media. A lot of the Alex Jones stuff went against the Bilderberg stuff and exposed it. What's interesting, if you go back into Mae Brussels' work, she does regular reports in the 1970s on the Bilderberg situation, which the media hides. This information that he's bringing forward is in the 1960s. So you see the real lineage here of understanding the dangers of the centralization. And what happens is, it falls into the hands of the fringe, as it were, right? This is how it's portrayed. And yet, over and over again, we come back to the same thing, which is they're looking to centralize. And there's even a Casey reading related to this where he says, you will see a war over just this thing about a one world currency. So we need to get together on the idea of what that represents and how the sovereignty is represented through the currency. So it doesn't elevate the level of money above people. It's the idea that, if you are a person and you lay down $100 and you are a person at the top levels and you lay down $100, they each have an equal value. But when you get into kind of a social credit currency system, that whole model will change and you'll be stuck with a China style, socio-fascisti, part communist, part fascist setup with the technology driving in the background. You escaped by that much the total COVID dictatorship. And, when they get into more and more emergency powers and the consolidation of those powers, which includes the UFO file and the sky event that can come from something like that, like the Avi Loeb trip that they're trying to do, where now Avi Loeb is saying, well, this, 3I Atlas is nuclear powered. How the hell do you know that, Avi? And Avi can probably hear me because his lab is only about a few blocks away. But he's part of this, with Mellon and Elizondo. They're part of the UFO threat aspect. They're going to try the nerd version, as we put on the record last week.
Nerd version. I love it.
Okay, so...
But can I throw something in?
Yeah.
Okay, so David Donaway says, Roosevelt gets Joe Kennedy to run the SEC after Kennedy was linked to Sam Bronfman and the Canadian Jewish mob.
Yes.
Sam Bronfman was a venerable knight of St. John of Jerusalem, deeply linked to Joe Kennedy Pilgrim Society, I think Joe Kennedy was doing a lot of money laundering for the mob and the military industrial complex.
You think Joe Kennedy is, well, Joe Kennedy was in the Pilgrim Society, and he, there is also a piece there when he becomes the ambassador to the UK. It's funny because I have some quotes from Dahl about Joe Kennedy. That might answer what you're saying. So I'd rather let him do it. I do want to point out again, this is Dahl, who marries Anna, and they do have a marriage for 8 years, but it ends unhappily with 2 children. And
Just add something here. I think this is really great because we're going into the roots of something. You have to go back in time, and because everything is about bloodlines for these people.
Exactly.
These are links that go back, and you can actually, hindsight is 2020. They weren't as great at obfuscation back in the day. So
there's no question.
There are books, there's records. We can see things more clearly. It's so valuable.
Oh, I think it is valuable. You also hit on something really big there, which is the move towards, digitization of everything leaves you open to incredible scrubbing of history. I mean, look what they do even now. So you can imagine how bad that situation could get.
So Corso, they removed him from Wikipedia.
They did. Well, they did other things. I'm glad you mentioned that. So I was doing an overview of how they were handling the CIA on Wikipedia.
Right.
It was extraordinary, but here's the most extraordinary one that I found. E. Howard Hunt, they have this incredible glowing thing about him. They don't say he has anything to do with the Kennedy assassination. They say he was kind of hoodwinked into doing Watergate. It's like, a relative wrote it. And then finally, when it gets to the point where, he confessed himself that he was a bench warmer on the JFK assassination, his son videotaped it, they put it out, Rolling Stone ran it, the mainstream media stayed away from it. How do they deal with that? How are you going to deal with that? The man himself, said that LBJ had done it and that he was involved as a bench warmer and all the rest. And how do they handle that? Well, they say, some family members wanted to make some money. They just manipulated audio clips, and that was that. There are, there's hours and hours of videotape confessions of E. Howard Hunt.
And he's sharp as
you're not going to get around that. And for Wikipedia to do that, it was very interesting. So in my, naivete, I said, well, I'm going to go in there and edit it. I found out when I went in there, it was very interesting, that I'm banned on Wikipedia from creating an entry, 1, based on my IP address, and 2, the person who did it, very interesting. The person calls himself Rodent. Rodent. They were like, we'll lift the ban in 2026. So this weird shadow banning of the work that we do on so many different social media networks, even ones that we're not familiar with, until we hit that thing. When I got to Wikipedia and I was going to make an edit or suggest an edit in relation to that, because it's absurd. I mean, it's one of the most ridiculous entries I've ever seen. It's complete propaganda. And it also lies about the fact that there's not videotape and hours of videotape of E. Howard Hunt, the CIA spy master, saying he was involved in the Kennedy assassination. I mean, come on. So they want to pretend, and, this is an open source thing and it's reliable and all the rest. So, Wikipedia is incredibly compromised. But what's fascinating is the amount of shadow banning that goes on that we wouldn't even be aware of. I wouldn't be aware of being shadow banned on Wikipedia unless I went to make that entry. Well, they were like, we know who you are. And the entry is fantastic because it says, you not only can you not edit things, you can't create anything on Wikipedia. You're not allowed to post anything. And that's not going to be lifted until 2026. And the person who put it in, he's making all this commentary and stuff. And the way he identifies himself as an admin is Rodent. That's it. That's all you get. So some faceless bureaucrat in the Wikipedia system bans dark journalists.
Or it could just be AI.
It could be AI, but it seemed like, this guy had a history of edits and all the rest of it. But that system is ready to block any expansion, shall we say, especially from dark journalism. But the Hunt thing, just go look at the Wikipedia on Hunt. You'll laugh. You will laugh. But they removed the Wikipedia entry for Philip Corso. I found that interesting, and I think it plays directly into what we're talking about here. Okay, so Dahl, because he is the son-in-law for 8 years, he gets to interact with the FDR White House. It's an interesting thing to note that when Kennedy went to run for president, one of his biggest opponents inside the Democratic Party was Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was pulling for her good old socialist pal, Adlai Stevenson, who had lost and been demolished by Eisenhower twice, to run again in 1960. Now, it's quite interesting because eventually she would have to, seeing Kennedy was going to get in anyway, she went along with it. But her speeches, her fiery speeches against Kennedy as being green, as being rich and out of touch and all the rest of it, are very interesting when you think about it. Certainly, there are interplays in Democratic politics, but her absolute opposition to Kennedy, I found, didn't really fit. It didn't really add up. And maybe we can get to the bottom of that. Interesting shot here of Theodore Roosevelt with FDR. It's the only picture on record of the two together. And of course, Theodore is already vice president, and Franklin is, kind of a college guy at that point. But I thought that was a fantastic snapshot of the power of those cousins there. And there's something to admire in the Roosevelts. Make no mistake about it. And I think, again, FDR being in the presidency is a kind of Iron Man during those periods because they're incredibly challenging for America. However, it's also a very dicey situation. Another fantastic, I was able to collect some fantastic shots. That is FDR with King George. And this is FDR doing one of these campaign things with a microphone there where the speaker is coming out of the back of the car and he's driving around giving a speech. This is how they used to do it. And it's important for us to realize that the tools that they had to work with as well. I have some quotes here directly from Dahl's book. Then I have a quick thing on the Shikini Knights, and then we're on to your questions. How's that? I'm running way, way over. But that's the way it goes. All right. What do you got there?
Nothing. Sorry, I'm talking to Joseph.
It's okay. Go for it.
He was mentioning that Buckley had a comment about Eleanor Roosevelt, and I asked him what it was, and he said, LOL, something. Hold on, I lost it.
Oh, yeah. A lot of people had really
something to the effect that everywhere she went, she, quote, spreads her squid-like ink of confusion on her flower-strewn march through history.
I mean, it's a remarkable life, right? It is, but what a character.
Well, she's the original sort of white liberal woman causing problems.
True.
Nothing new.
Yeah, she's her relationship with FDR, I think, quite interesting. But okay, so Dahl, and remember this with Dahl, that he becomes disenchanted, obviously, with Roosevelt's world, but he also has that great bird's eye view from being in that White House for so many years and hearing what the daughter had to say, talking with FDR, talking with the advisors, spent all this time with Henry Wallace, who becomes FDR's VP. And of course, FDR and Wallace have this big mystical back and forth. We've done episodes on President X, who is Wallace. And he was going to be President X because he was directly out of that Theosophical Lodge. So you were going to have an esoteric presidency. They pulled the plug at the last minute, literally, by setting off the fire alarm when they were nominating Wallace. The next day he came back and they had bamboozled Harry Truman into that spot. When the election goes through, bang, on April 12th, FDR passes away. And at that point, it's only a couple of months into his fourth term. He's the only president to have served or won that many terms. And Truman goes from senator of Missouri, and of course that includes Cape Girardeau, where there's a major UFO crash in 1941, and he oversees it. And there's some very interesting stories about how he oversees it and the secrecy involved with Vannevar Bush utilizing all of his Masonic mystery skill to keep that a secret. And then Truman is catapulted to the vice presidency almost overnight with no one expecting it. He gets in, and our friend FDR dies. And there he is completely, because FDR felt that Truman was hoisted upon him and didn't share a number of things with him, like the Manhattan Project. Truman is at the, he's at the whim of whatever is going on there. That's where you get things like the Central Intelligence Agency being created, the National Security Act, and all the rest. Truman is really bamboozled. By his second term, he's doing things a lot differently, but a lot of things have already been hoisted upon him. When the Kennedy assassination takes place, he writes a major op-ed in the afternoon version of the Washington Post. And it says, CIA, mend it or end it. Whatever is going on there, it's very suspicious, and it's making the United States look bad. It was a month to the day after the Kennedy assassination. Truman understood exactly the role of the CIA in the assassination and put that on the record. The evening edition did not carry it. They got rid of it. And he got a visit from the ousted CIA director, Allen Dulles, who Kennedy had fired, saying, you need to print a retraction. And Truman said, no, I'm not going to do it. And he said, don't you understand what could happen? Basically threatening him. And according to Truman's aide, Truman said, I'm old. You're not going to be able to pull this routine with me. And so our friend Dulles goes back and he does a big interview with the Washington Post. And he says, oh, yeah, well, he's heading into Alzheimer's there. I'm not sure all of his faculties are with us. So he was a good president, but, he's got dementia. So that gives you an idea of the contempt that they have. But they knew that they were outed there because, after all, he had created the Frankenstein. Who better to call it out in public? And he did. And that's not something that is highly featured when you hear about these things in history. But Truman was basically like, if you can't improve that situation of their paramilitary covert operations, going unchecked, then you need to scrap it. Very simple. All right, Dahl. Here's a few things that he had to put on the record. He's quoting here. Give me control over a nation's currency, and I care not who makes its laws. This awesome statement comes from Mayer Amschel Rothschild, the head and founder of the vast banking complex bearing his name. Today, that empire has acquired unconstitutional control of much of the money and wealth in the United States. By means of the effective control of the privately owned Federal Reserve banking system, Abraham Lincoln tried hard to prevent such a situation. The destructive force referred to is therefore aimed at all religions, including Christianity, right across the board. Upon the base of several ancient secret European groups, Adam Weishaupt, on May 1st, 1776, the May Day of the Communists, founded or recreated the order which he called the Illuminati, or the Enlightened. Weishaupt was a member of the Bavarian Catholic family educated by the Jesuits. His personal religion, however, gradually deteriorated, and in due course, it became the worship of evil. His scheme was a world revolutionary conspiracy which aimed to destroy all existing governments and religions. In lieu of the same, he planned to set up a one-world government controlled, however, by a carefully chosen despot. This was in 1776. Interesting, it's the same year, of course, as the Founding Fathers. In 1848, Karl Marx published his often discussed books, The Communist Manifesto, in London. He received much direct financial aid from Clinton Roosevelt. Now, Clinton Roosevelt is very important here because he is a distant cousin of FDR and Theodore Roosevelt. And he creates this uh, science and nature communist book. Now, again, the aims around genuine communism, the idea of, people being communal and everybody having enough is fine. The problem is over and over again, the implementation of that central state and giving up all your rights and powers to it. So the systems and the conversation about the systems, don't really give us the whole of it. So some of these people back there writing about how we need to get out of capitalism and things like that, if you were doing that in the 19th century, it might not have the same bearing as it does when it's implemented under Stalin and under these other rulers. So that's something to keep in mind. But one of the things I find fascinating is this Roosevelt was connected directly to a secret society in New York. And that's what we're going to go to next. And then we'll take your question. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 202, the Illuminati Deep Events Secret Network. There's a whole piece here about how this spills out into those who become the space lords and the continuity of government lords. And they are using the same tactics that they use to consolidate the money supply, to give us this kind of secret space program, and to give us the secret world underground that's controlled by elites, and all under the guise of government security and things of this nature. And the only way, when they start to lose this political control on the surface, then you get into the emergency powers thing. And that's so much of how this works. But going back to how these people who are on the inside viewed the Illuminati, for me, is absolutely fascinating. What do you got there, Miss Olivia?
Humanarium again. The private central banking cartels fund both sides. Wall Street funded the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And Darla Cash says most of FDR's thoughts, his political ammunition, as it were carefully manufactured for him in advance by the Council on Foreign Relations, One World Money Group, brilliantly and with great gusto.
Well, yeah, it's interesting too, because we think about what he actually wanted. And he did a number of things. I mean, a lot of programs that were implemented, like Social Security and things like that, obviously had a great benefit. They understood, and they had a fundamental nature of what the country was and what was missing for us beforehand. So he did implement incredible changes on one hand, and then how that system gets abused and pilfered, etc. That becomes the major thrust of the story. I also want to mention that Herbert Hoover, when he becomes president, the Depression happens in his first year, but he was a serious government engineer and had figured out a number of the things that become the New Deal, even though he was Republican. So he just thought, oh, Roosevelt is way over the top. But in fact, a lot of the things that he laid out were plans for pensions. There were a lot of public works pieces that were associated with Hoover. So this was, the population and the nature of the economy and the nature of the situation demanded a different kind of a setup. And I think it's interesting because what happens is you go from the Depression and you keep going from that Depression. And it is really, if you look at those stats, it's not until World War II when we pull out of it. So it is war. It's that war economy that makes the United States such a powerhouse. And then after the fact of World War II, we experienced the biggest boom in home ownership, population, and everything else. So the society that we understand as America really rolls forward from the 50s. Before that, this start struggling. I mean, you've got the Great Depression, you've got the Dust Bowl, you've got World War I. You had all those people from World War I who came back and couldn't get jobs. The government wasn't interested in that. So the government needed to adjust itself. And these were people who were kind of in the breach and figuring out that system. I think what's interesting about Roosevelt is he became the closest thing that we've had to a monarch, because he was just in there and so powerful. And by the time he is, going into the end of his second term, his own VP is turned against him because he wants to do things like pack the Supreme Court, and he I mean, Roosevelt is becoming that centralized control force. So he's becoming the caricature of the thing that he started out to be. So there are ups and downs there with Roosevelt.
Well,
Yes.
it's never let a crisis go to waste.
Yes. Oh
Mhm.
yeah, absolutely. Um okay, yeah. So I promised to read this. This was the letter, the back and forth between George Washington and his friend, whose name is also confusingly George Washington.
What?
Yeah, it's George on George here. And this gets so wild, but let's see if we can ride with it. And remember, our friend George was no stranger to mysticism. He was deep, deep in the Masonic lodges and the Masonic groups that were foundational in the Americas, the founding fathers and their influence around it. You know, there are beneficial knowledge groups in that period in America. Okay, so his friend George is writing to him and he says, "It was some time since this book fell into my hands entitled Proof of a Conspiracy by John Robison." Here, like I said, they're talking about, hey, have you read this conspiracy book? This is 1798, which gives a full account of the Society of Freemasons that distinguishes itself by the name of Illuminati, whose plan is to overturn the government and all religion, even natural. Do you see how much they knew in 1798? And who endeavor to eradicate every idea of a supreme being and distinguish man from the beast by his shape only. A thought suggested itself to me that some of the lodges in the United States might have caught action and might cooperate with the Illuminati or the Jacobins Club in France. Fauché is mentioned by Robison as a zealous member, and who can doubt Genet and others? Have not these and their confidants in this country? They use the same expressions and are generally men of no religion. Upon serious reflection, I was led to think that it might be within your power to prevent this horrid plan from corrupting the brethren of the English lodge over which you preside. I send you proof of a conspiracy, the book, which I doubt not will give you satisfaction and afford you matter for a train of ideas and may operate in our national felicity. If, however, you've already perused the book, it will not, I trust, be disagreeable to you that I have presumed to address you with the letter in the book accompanying it. It proceeded from the sincerity of my heart and my ardent wishes for the common good. May the supreme ruler of things continue you long in these perilous times, and may he endow you with strength and wisdom and save our country. Okay, so here's how the George Washington we know responds to George Washington. On October 10th, 1798, Sir, it is more than a fortnight since I acknowledged the receipt of your first letter on the subject of the Illuminati and thanked you for Robinson's account of that society. It went to the post office, as usual, addressed to the Reverend Mr. Snyder of Fredericktown, Maryland. George Washington Snyder, GWS. If it had not been received before this mishap, it must have attended it, which I pray you to advise me, as it were, if it had not been received at the date of your last not being mentioned. I am George Washington. And then he gets a series of letters from this guy being like, didn't you read the book? What's going on? All disappointed. And then he responds to him and says, basically, you haven't been getting my letters. And so George Washington, our George Washington, says, it was not my intention to doubt that the doctrines of the Illuminati and the principles of Jacobinism have not spread into the United States. On the contrary, no one is more fully satisfied of this fact than I am. The idea I meant to convey was that I did not believe that the lodges of Freemasons in the country had, as societies, endeavored to propagate the diabolical tenets of the first or the pernicious principles of the latter, if they are susceptible. That individuals of them may have done it, and that the founder or instrument employed to found the democratic societies in the United States may have had these objects and actually had a separation of the people from their government in view is too evident to be questioned. Now, here's what I think that Washington is getting at. He's saying, look, the Illuminati is one thing, and we need to guard against their influence. But the Masonic lodges, I don't think, take on that influence, although you will have members who are trying to pervert the thing, and it is susceptible. So he's giving it, this very kind of balanced treatment. But you can see there, and you can see in Jefferson's letter warning of the influence of this Bavarian Illuminati, that they're very worried about this infesting the government and taking control. And you could say, when you get to Rudolf Steiner's comment that by the 1920s, the mystery schools, good or bad, control about 80% of the political field, that battle was ongoing. Flash forward 100 years later, and here we are. Where is that battle? Well, probably the secret societies run close to 100% of what you see politically. And the balance, again, going back and forth between kind of right-hand side and left side, not right-left politics, but those groups and their purposes. This is the battle going on in the background, and it gets us into the battle of the technology. So when you're seeing this battle take place over history, and you look at it through the Depression, World War II, and then you go into periods like McCarthyism, or you go into the period of the Kennedy assassination, those links, those threads, the things that they're talking about the battle and the background between these groups become even more apparent. And so by the time we get to Golden Dome, AI, Trump versus the super Kamala communists, you're not, the battle is joined. And again, the influences and the things, if there are people on the Trump side, as Peter Dale Scott suggested, that were the America First, that thin contingent in the deep state, the American Manufacturers Society, who believed in Fortress America. We have two oceans, and we don't need to go conquering over there. This is an important piece for us to thread together and say, on one hand, you have the factions, and you look at it from the deep state side. There's a mystical component to it. They're even referring to it in the Founding Fathers' documents relating to the Illuminati. That's where he's getting at. I have more here to get to, but we're going to have to roll it with your questions because my time's up and you have the floor, Miss Olivia.
Okay, Karen Carpenter, I've been wondering a lot if the Kennedys, Trumps, Roosevelts, etc., are involved in generational abuse, MK Ultra, etc. What does DJ think? This may account for some of their behavior.
If the Kennedys are involved in that? No.
Well, the sexual shenanigans.
No, the Kennedys, what's funny is there's a very interesting entry in the Devil's Chessboard book talking about how the Kennedys objected to the Dulles brothers utilizing sex slaves. It's pretty interesting the way that all works, because what you're talking about are two different things. So there's the whole impact of personal behavior, which is what I think you're getting at with the Kennedys, and a number of people when they get up on that level. But that's different from the other part that you meant, like human trafficking and things like that. That is a criminal endeavor. And there's a whole system and network for that criminal endeavor. So you have to, you can't throw someone who's a playboy in with the kind of depravity of that. So we need to understand what we're talking about. I think with the Kennedys, there is, what's most fascinating to me is some of those habits that they learned from the father about being accepted had to do with Hollywood. And so you find over and over again, whoever did the psychological profile on the Kennedys around the Central Intelligence Agency knew that their weakness was going to be related to Hollywood and being accepted on that level. And it is through Hollywood that they get manipulated. And that's where that whole kind of Sinatra piece, the organized crime piece, so that these people will be in his orbit. And of course, Judith Exner, who we've done some shows on, she's not understood in history as she should be. Not only does she expose that Kennedy is working in the background through figures like Sam Giancana. And it's not, oh, let's go assassinate Castro. It's show me those exotic technology blueprints that he's getting from defense contractors. He's going behind the back and using a human intelligence network to get to the bottom of where the advanced technology is at and why, I have a NASA document which talks about Blue Gemini. And, Blue is the program that is all about the secret exotic technology. We put the blue part on the record because I found these things. But one of the things that it says about Blue Gemini, and I showed this to Olivia, she was shocked. It said, we don't know basically how Blue Gemini came about, but we know it's neither officially sanctioned nor officially supported. How do you get a program in NASA, Blue Gemini, the most advanced space program at that period, if it's not sanctioned? Who made it? That's your secret space program. That's what Kennedy was objecting. And he said, we don't need two space programs. And he sent McNamara over to NASA to say, we'll kick it back to the military, who is at least the devil that we know. That exchange in history, which we didn't get the full brunt of until 2014, 2015, is very important and significant for the period that we're in, especially with the blackout on what's going on in space. We don't know anything about space. You've got crazy man Elon Musk and SpaceX. You've got NASA, and this guy saying, well, I haven't got the alien briefing yet, but I can't wait to hear about it. And they just are so flimsy with everything. We have no idea. Space is a complete mystery, just like the whole underground involvement in the continuity of government program, the emergency powers, the thing that's been built up there since the Eisenhower era. The regular public has no idea. All we know and what's happening is consolidation from above. So you control things on the ground from space. That's the thing. That's why we've been out of the loop since 1972, the last time we went to the moon. What's gone on 53 years in between? Hey, we haven't heard from you in 53 years. You're going back to the moon? Every year they say they're going back to the moon. I guess they will eventually, but it's been a long time. And what happened for 53 years? You privatized the space and handed it over to, half with it lunatics like Musk so you could manipulate them like Howard Hughes. I don't know. It's a weird situation. We don't understand what's going on in space. And I think that Space Force was an effort by Trump in the first term to pull that whole piece of the UFO file uncertainty, the unknowables, back under executive control, which is where it belongs. So we're in a complete blank zone when it comes to that. Kennedy, there's a window there in the early 1960s where he confronts NASA with Blue Gemini and says, what is that? And Blue Gemini is the public, that's the public version. The private version, that's the whole Blue program behind the scenes. We don't get a look at what that is, but we do get a look at that clash. And I think it's interesting because when you see that interplay of what goes on there, NASA in their own documents says that Blue Gemini is not sanctioned and it's not an official program. So did some rogue scientists just come together and start launching stuff? This is where it gets interesting. And that's where I guess a lot of the rumors about Paperclip doing their own thing come into play for real. Yes.
Okay, David Donaway. So Cecil Rhodes Rothschild emulate the Jesuit intelligence networks. Skull and Bones, Stephen Schwartzman scholars emulate Cecil Rhodes scholars. Continuity of government has a lot to do with Skull and Bones. George H.W. Bush, who I think had control of Reagan. You wanted to talk about COG.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. Bush, what they were going to do was they were going to install Bush. They were using Reagan to get Bush in. Bush ran for president, and like when he ran for Senate, and he bombed out in Congress as well, he won once in his entire life. And, he bombed, and he was bombing as a presidential candidate. Reagan was mopping the floor with him, and people could see through him. And he called Reagan voodoo economics and stuff. So they were bitter enemies. What they did was they tried to attach Ford to Reagan when he was on a runaway thing. And then Ford said in a CBS interview, it's going to be a co-presidency. I'll be president sometimes, he'll be president sometimes. It's really weird. So Reagan called him up and said, you're out. I'm not doing that. And then supposedly he got a meeting with David Rockefeller, and Rockefeller said, obviously the best way to unify the party is to put Bush on your ticket. And that it came that their full support came with the price tag of Bush. But you see, just like with this early assassination attempt on Roosevelt, as soon as they get Reagan in, the assassination attempt with Hinckley takes place in March. So you get inaugurated in June, shot down in March. And it was close, very close, just like Butler was close. See, the assassination program is active. It just took place. It almost completely torn asunder the 2024 election. There were multiple attempts. There were 3 actually, but there was the one major one that almost succeeded. We have no answers about, which is the Butler PA and Thomas Matthew Crooks. We don't even know if that was Thomas Matthew Crooks on the top of that building. That's our information zone. And you even have people who have reputations as truth tellers, like Kash Patel at FBI and stuff. They're not giving any. Where's the information? Where's the information about Matthew Urich, who looked exactly like Crooks and was apparently there that day as well? Where did that story go? And the reports that were coming in during the assassination attempt saying, oh, there's this guy, the Crooks guy, the guy who was on the roof, he just headed off into the forest. We call him, they were calling him Flatface. Who was that guy? And the nonsense around the Secret Service agent, the director at that time, and the amount of things that she had to do, to explain herself. And then finally she just quits. What are you going to do? Well, she was the COG agent who pulled Dick Cheney into the bunker during 9/11. So she had the COG lineage. She was, in there. I can't say that she was complicit, but the entire setup of the Secret Service was absurd. They were waiting for Trump to get shot in Butler last July, or July of 2024. So none of that's been explained. And Crooks himself, he was going to go to the university in Moon. Yeah, I've explained that Moon was basically like a major X geography. That's, there's an area 51 there in Moon. So very strange. And there's not a lot of answers.
I wanted to ask you about Moon
Yeah.
and Shikini, and if they are in close proximity at all.
No, Shikini is more eastern, and it would reflect maybe, the Rosicrucian foundations there in Pennsylvania came about through Philadelphia, and so many incredible things happened through Philadelphia. And then if you go further north, and you go into that wonderful country, that Shikini is up there, and it is beautiful. I have pictures of it that I will show before we're done. Speaking of, kind of MK Ultra and Illuminati, that of course is Bill Clinton being thrust into the spotlight by being shown shaking hands with JFK. It's very interesting that Cord Meyer, who Hunt said was deeply involved in the Kennedy assassination, and who Mary Meyer was very close with JFK, who was Cord's wife, got divorced, whatever. It's very interesting that he would say, we had Clinton from the beginning. So the Central Intelligence Agency. So they probably put that little photo up together there when Clinton is 15 or whatever. Actually, he's 16. And I think it is interesting to think about with Meyer and all the rest, because of course, Mary Meyer knew so much about Kennedy, confided so much in with her that after the assassination, she was found. She got shot there just a couple months later, where she usually walked, and so originally they grabbed this person. They were like, "Oh, it was a terrible mugging gone wrong," and they killed her. And then they realized, oh, that person wasn't even there at the time. And they let him go. So it's a very unexplained crime. It's very strange in any history of any country to see when you get around the Kennedy assassination, it is a complete, this is a complete and utter death spiral. Everyone around that, and including Marilyn Monroe and these other people. And you can see the bigwigs that were involved around on the periphery, like Shinkana and stuff. Whenever there was a committee hearing or whatever, those people would get bumped off. Roselli, they're doing a JFK committee. We can't have him come up, get rid of him. And the lists, of course, of deaths associated with the Warren Commission and the original crime, the numbers would go up every time they would have another investigation. So it's incredible control, and it's absurd. It's like the elephant in the room. What secret organization is bumping off all these people? And that expands into other areas. When we get it into the whole banking thing, there were all these people who got deleted on the banking thing. The holistic doctors get eliminated. It's a pattern, but it's so clear in the Kennedy case that you're looking at decades and decades of it. Yes.
Katie Cat says, handshake of death, Clinton's first victim, JFK.
Wow. I think it's interesting. Obviously, they were positioning Clinton there. Absolutely. No question about it. I wanted to mention this since I mentioned Roosevelt. Let's see if I can squeeze this in, and we'll take more questions. This gets pretty wild. If I can pull this off, you will say this is the X series of the century episode. Okay. Now, we've got a person there named Clinton Roosevelt, who is a cousin of FDR and Teddy. And he is associated up there in upstate New York. He's a politician. And he puts together this whole kind of communist manifesto early, 1848, 1849. Now, the people around him, he gets accused of being part of this group. And this group is associated with a governor named DeWitt Clinton. Now, this guy's name is Clinton Roosevelt. And they're saying DeWitt Clinton, there's a weird crisscross here. DeWitt Clinton, very interestingly, is the guy who was deep in politics. He was governor of New York, and he is the one who created the Erie Canal. And he was apparently engaged in kind of mystical ceremonies with the Seneca Indians, which is where the whole idea of the Erie Canal came from. So there's a lot of mysticism around him, including the fact that he's associated with all these mystery lodges, but they're trying to use that against this guy, Roosevelt. Okay, you still with me? Good. What they called this was the Colombian Illuminati. The following paper, this is written by Richard Carlisle and Dr. David Harrison. I don't believe it's in a book. It's just a paper, academic paper floating around about this group. The following paper examines the little-known story of the Colombian Illuminati and has been edited for my recent publication. The book is an in-depth examination of the Masonic work of the early 19th century. I guess there is a book. And Richard Carlisle, a work known as the Manual of Freemasonry. There it is. This book has become popular with English Freemasons. Go on. All right. They go through a very detailed history, and then we get to this character. His name was Palmer, and he was born in Connecticut in 1764, originally studying to become a Presbyterian minister. And it was after his graduation in 1787 that he embraced deism. he made his way down to New York, where he formed a theistical society, which, as we shall see, was given the rather sensationalist name of the Colombian Illuminati by a certain writer of the period. Like Thomas Paine, Palmer was an avid writer and political agitator. His A 4th of July oration, printed in 1797. Being typical for his political ideas, Palmer praised the American Revolution but attacked the way that the priests could still assert power over the minds of men, having pretended to hold a high in social intercourse with celestial powers. Palmer also followed two deist journals, The Temple of Reason in 1800 and The Moral World. Okay. The Colombian Illuminati of New York was a name presented in a work of political writer John Wood, published in Newark, New Jersey. I think this guy was onto something. In the work, he linked them to Clintonians, supporters of DeWitt Clinton, who had served as senator of New York 1802, 1803, and also as governor. Wood, who was originally from Scotland but had settled in New York in 1800, also wrote another pamphlet around the same time named The History of the Administration of John Adams, which was a poisonous political work written in a similar vein to his Colombian Illuminati exposure. This exposure, entitled A Full Exposition of the Clintonian Faction in the Society of the Colombian Illuminati, gives a dark view of Palmer's so-called Colombian Illuminati. Now, flash forward a little while, and there's a very interesting inventor named Marion Stanzel, and he wants to create a perpetual motion machine. And he's like a Tesla of the 20th century. And he is a huge innovator who has this incredible kind of desire and passion. And at a certain point in the 1930s, he finds out about Edgar Cayce, and he goes to Edgar Cayce for a psychic reading about his perpetual motion engine. Keep all of this in mind about DeWitt Clinton, about society and everything, as we now go to Edgar Cayce and Marion Stanzel. Now, Stanzel is given some readings, and he says, I've been shown this incredible thing in visions, and also I was in a war zone, and building exploded, and I was in the hospital, and this figure came to me and showed me how to create a perpetual motion machine. And Cayce tells him, yeah, you're being contacted by this entity in the psychic realm telling you how to do this.
Did he say what the entity was?
Well, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to read the reading. All right. Gertrude is giving the reading. You'll have before you the body and inquiring mind of Mr. 195. That's what they called him. The introspective experience is coming concerning the perpetual motion motor. And then they go through all the things that he wants to ask. And Cayce says in trance, yes, quite a large order in that one. Yes, we have the inquiring mind and the motor and the drawing of the motor, a portion of which we have had before. These should not be confusion in that of the introspective experiences of each. While these experiences are of the same condition and approaching at one point from a different angle, they are present for mental application of the individual, which each are presented. So he's saying, you're getting psychic information here. And so the question is, in my introspective experience, I saw a nun who said, say perpetual. After saying this, the nun said, look. On looking, I saw a motor turning over. Then I heard a voice say, he of the mechanical mind, you of the faith. It is my will, said God. Then saw himself with a valise going on a train. After this, I saw myself, and the thought came to me, who should go? The answer came to me, ask Cayce. And then he talks about his wife, who's a devout Catholic, and all the rest. And then, so Cayce answers that the information that the mechanical mind representing through that source, through whom the experiences come, as relating to that one to whom the application is to be made, see, then, is from Clinton DeWitt. Clinton deceased. Clinton DeWitt died in the 19th century. And as is that seen, that each as seen traveling should travel from the place, the experiences that should be had by each, the attempted development of the mechanical appliance, they give that to be perpetual in its activity. And as the faith, the nature to induce the surroundings necessary for this development will come about, then travel to that place to see. So he's interpreting all the symbols that this guy has seen. In the experience, as was seen, there is scene one bending over the motor and examining and pointing out the conditions that have baffled the endeavors of the body, 195, who is Stanzel, to bring about the motion as desired. The present status of the motor will need some changes, even as has been pointed out by the entity. Now, I'm going to skip ahead because he talks all about how the machine will work. And the perpetual motion motor is something just like, 0-point energy or free energy, whatever it would happen to be. This is something that's been sought and questioned by scientists and guys like Tesla for years. And then they talk all about the nature of the actual machine. But the upshot that goes on here is that Casey tells him again, as this person appears to him and shows him this outline of the motor, the guy comes back to him and it's like, who is this? What is going on here? And they say, what entity gave me this new model? Casey answers, it was Clinton. Regarding the number one and number two drawings in the letter, which I hold in my hand and not the shape of the cam guide over in the figure, what is this? And he gives them an explanation. And then they say, finally, when you say Clinton, what Clinton? And Casey answers, as given, George DeWitt Clinton. Now, it goes on, and eventually it comes out that DeWitt Clinton is giving information to Marion Stanzel to build the perpetual motion energy motor. Now, just briefly, quick thing here about our friend. This is DeWitt Clinton demonstrating how the Erie Canal will work. This individual, as a discarnate, is appearing to the mind of this inventor and showing him how to make a perpetual motion energy device. So you understand from a mystical point of view, when you leave out all the mystical side of things, you lose a lot, because if this can happen, if DeWitt Clinton, who was this politician inventor who created the Erie Canal and everything else, can appear to this guy and apparently work with the problem of the 20th century of creating a perpetual motion motor, so we wouldn't have had all those problems with oil and everything else and wars. And it's very interesting what became of Stanzel's motor, which, it didn't come to its full fruition, but his work was stolen and his lab was destroyed in the late 60s as he was getting older. It is interesting to note that when we're talking about DeWitt Clinton, he has this incredible background as an innovator, trying to create things like the Erie Canal. And so for him as a discarnate to appear to Marion Stanzel after he had this kind of near-death experience and create this incredible device is the kind of remarkable action that takes place on this other level with other awareness. So when these people are going into these secret societies and things, some of it is to get information like that. And we need to be very aware of how that works. But here is Casey, who is 100%, reliable in terms of his psychic discourse, in terms of what he's talking about. And he's saying, here's this entity on the other side giving it to them. So what are we to make of that? It shows a great deal. And I will say this, DeWitt Clinton was a York Rite Freemason. He was initiated in the Holland Lodge, number 16, which is now number 8, in New York on September 3rd, 1790. In 1806, he was elected Grand Master of the Grand Lodge in New York. Clinton was essential in establishing the Grand Encampment of Knights Templar in the United States and served as the first, second, and third Grand Master, born 1816 to 1828. He retained the title until his death in 1828. As I mentioned, he was also known to take part in these mystical ceremony with the Seneca Indians. My belief is that, as Casey has talked about and as Steiner has talked about, some of these groups and some of these lodges learn how to project themselves into that astral place. And then by the time that they die, when they're in the astral zone, they can project themselves here with ease. And they become a resource for these other people who are able to do this. So that's a whole psychic, mystical side. So when we started the program out and we had people like Gene Dixon and Taylor Caldwell on either side of Strom Thurmond and Philip Corso, how do those strange bedfellows make any sense? They make a lot more sense if you understand them as groups that are all at the heart of mystery teaching. Then the entire thing opens up on a completely different level. And DeWitt Clinton and his relationship with this unusual lodge is, a fantastic example. And Casey bringing through the information that this is the discarnate who's giving you that means there are people on the other side, scientifically, who can feed ideas to us here in our present reality. That's the kind of breakthrough that when you're talking about mystery schools or masonry or whatever, when you deal on that esoteric level, you're on a totally different level. No wonder their secret society. Yes.
Bethany G says mysticism and esotericism are inextricably linked with politics. Let's make that public. That's the point.
Well, it is.
Whole episode.
There's no question. And you can see it. I mean, the very imagery around the founding fathers and the dollar bill and all the rest of it. And of course, it was Wallace who reinserted the Great Seal of the United States on our currency. And what was Wallace doing there before he got jettisoned as vice president to FDR and Truman took over? He was setting up readings with Edgar Casey. He was setting up a series of 3 readings. And the person who attests to that is Harmon Brough, who was a 19-year-old who went down to visit Casey because his mother had written an article in something kind of like the Saturday Evening Post. And the article had taken off. And this guy was like, I have the summer off. I'm going to go visit this Casey guy or whatever. And while he was answering phones for him, the vice president's office said, we want to book a series of readings with Edgar Casey. So, the overlap with the groups and the mystery teachings in all of this. And of course, Manly P. Hall has given us a great deal about the mystery of the founding of America. You have to understand it's operating on a number of levels. And so when we look at mystery groups, if we can get to the bottom of some core understanding when it comes to these things, then stuff like the Illuminati won't just be like a pop headline or something to throw on the fact of, somebody wearing a pentagram or whatever. It's going to be a deep understanding of what the symbolism is. The more that we understand it on our level, the less subliminal its impact and the better educated we are. But then you get into the whole, also the richness of what the mystery traditions have for us. And so I think this is the crucial understanding. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Woo! X Series 202, Illuminati, Deep State, Deep Events, and the Secret Network. So many things involved there. Take a couple more questions and wrap it up. Of course, I want to remind you, if you're new here, go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch and around all the incredible secrecy. The secrecy is only going to ramp up in the fall. And with the UFO hearings, particularly, it's going to ramp up because they don't want to hear the real thing. But you can get around all of that and it takes only a moment to sign up. It's free, and it lets you know about the incredible docuseries and interviews and very exciting, mind-blowing X-series episodes we have coming up for you, and the great interviews we have that are just coming up for you in the fall. Yes.
Okay, David Donaway says, right, but the mysticism and esotericism must control money, energy, and information. So he's saying that it's primary. It's the mysticism and esotericism is at the very top of the pyramid. It's not a kink that people get when they become so powerful that and have this, they have so much control that they just sort of, get into kind of funky things.
No, it's a tool. It's a tool. It's a lineage, and it's. I mean, those schools have existed since Atlantis, right? So yeah, I mean, it's a fundamental understanding, deep, but it is it's been understood as for a select group. This is the nature of some of the issues. And a lot of the secrecy, I remember this conversation that came up with Steiner at the end of his life. And there was someone there who was gifted with all of their spiritual work and wanted to start, this is Max Heindel, he wanted to start another order. And he wanted Steiner to help him do it. And Steiner at first was open to it because he was thinking, well, maybe he can make a breakthrough in America. But then he started to realize as Heindel was laying things out, he was like, oh, this is another secret group. And the problem now is we can't just go into that secrecy. A lot of this is about letting things out. And the mystery schools have held back and held back and held back. They have been, by and large, a positive influence on the culture. And the culture very often can't handle it when things come out from these deeper schools. But there was Steiner saying, the secrecy, like we've really had to play with the secrecy, and let's try to open this up, and that's what I think he was doing. As a matter of fact, a lot of his, although Ahriman appears in occult science, a lot of his Ahriman lectures were originally for students. And when World War I hit, he felt that the mystery schools and anthroposophy had failed. And he said, you know what, let the stuff out, because maybe this is part of the problem. It's not hitting enough people. And it's quite interesting to me because I feel like Steiner is such a great predictor of things, but he's also a good weather vane, how he responded in that era of tremendous tumult, being in Germany in World War I. I mean, your entire reality decimated. And a lot of those groups, as we know, like the development of the Nazis and all the rest of it, they couldn't stand Steiner. They felt like he was a cult competition, really. So ultimately, they contributed to burning down the great Goetheanum that he had put together. So they made great headway keeping him down, but he created anthroposophy, which is being reborn here in the 21st century to what he crafted it to be. So, you're in the middle, you are in the middle of a number of interesting forces. Miss Olivia.
George Jetson, DJ, where do you find all these cool readings from Casey, like the Marion ones? Also, can you help me with some spelling on the name of the perpetual motion machine person, please?
Stanzel. So it's Stansell. I don't know. With Casey, I've been reading Casey since I was like 7, something like that, 6 or 7 years old. So it's all in there. And all of that stuff, I started getting into all of that stuff at a ridiculously young age, but I was interested in it immediately. So Steiner's work, Gurdjieff's work, by the time I was a teenager, this stuff was regular, it was like a regular part of my thought process. So I think I just, over time, accumulated an interest in things. What I find interesting is all of that stuff, as much as I've studied it, there's always new things about it to learn. And this is the incredible thing, that sometimes I feel that some of these figures, like Steiner, like others, it's almost like they live a number of lifetimes. because you think to yourself, you look at some of Steiner's lectures and you're like, maybe somebody could have done this, or Casey's readings, like 20,000 readings over the course of 40 years, and the whole story of Atlantis in there. There's something very unusual about it. I'll tell you one thing that I know about mystery schools is you have to have a regular outlet. They have you do things. And Steiner's, a lot of people don't know this, but he was a play and movie reviewer. So all the other stuff that he did, the biodynamic farming, the Waldorf schools, Eurythmy, whatever, he had a regular gig where he would write reviews of plays or silent films. And, he was a reviewer. So the schools give you that. They keep you in society, and that's an interesting thing. I think there's a certain period where going away to a monastery and, Mount Athos and stuff. But once the period of the 20th century came in, the mystery schools adapted 19th, 20th century, and you had to be able to create the experience in the middle of your everyday life. The fourth way in Gurdjieff's work is a lot like that. And it was interesting because Bennett, who was a student who was always looking to find Gurdjieff's sources, over and over again found the people who were higher ranking had very kind of mundane, regular, average grade, but just everyday jobs. Barbers, librarian, police, whatever it was. It wasn't like they were on some exalted thing. They were in the regular flow of their lives. So, but they were high adepts. So it's sometimes I think the image of the mystery schools is just, strange thing off there and the figures in robes and things. But the information comes from a deep source, and it's the whole, what the schools left behind in Greece, which is know thyself, So they're dealing with that. Pythagoras school, the musical scale. These are the great gifts to humanity in language, architecture, Notre Dame, the Great Pyramid. It's an understanding of a larger world that you inhabit, and you choose it, though. You have free will. You can choose that, or you can have a completely checked out, mundane world where you play video games and watch sports. I don't know, but it's up to you. What piques your interest. Does that answer the question? I forgot the original question.
I'm already on to other things myself. America's Choice has George H.W. Bush married Aleister Crowley's daughter. So there's that. Do you want to bring up that mystery school?
Look, I will say this. There have been a lot of BS things in the conspiracy world, like, oh, John Trump was, Julian Assange's dad. Mm-hmm. Nonsense like that. But the one about Barbara Bush and the fact that her mother went over and did spend time with Crowley, and Crowley did all of his weird sex magic rituals, and that family was really out there and, grasping. It's always been highly believable to me that Barbara Bush was Crowley's daughter. I can't say it for sure, but I'd say the DNA test would be about 50-50. What you got?
Out of Ford says, how about Baron Trump being a time traveler? LOL.
Well, I'll tell you, Baron is very unusual because he's got that incredible height, and then there's the incredible and very strange book from the 1890s, which is all about the magical adventures of Baron Trump. And then that same author wrote the Last President. I mean, this is, rather remarkable. It's definitely somebody who's seeing into the future if they're not predicting it. So you got something special there. I can't let the show end without touching on Joseph Miltier, who's at the crux of so many of the things that we've talked about tonight, including Liberty Lobby, and Dahl invites him to speak and all this stuff. And I don't even know if a lot of people know who Joseph Miltier is, but I'm going to read this out of Professor Scott's remarkable book, Dallas 63, The First Deep State Revolt Against the White House. And then we'll take your last question and wrap up with that. How are you doing over there?
I'm wiped out.
Okay. The predictions of Joseph Miltier. Shortly before the Kennedy assassination, a Southern racist and activist, Joseph Miltier, predicted to Miami police informant, Willie Somerset, how the murder would be done from an office building with a high-powered rifle. Beyond question, Miltier was an organizer for two parties, the National States Rights Party, the former had Admiral John Connellan in it, and the Constitution Party of former Marine General Pedro Del Valle. Del Valle, I wish I could gut into him. We're going to do another episode dealing with some of these characters because it gets fascinating. In October 63, Miltier was at a meeting of the Constitution Party along with Del Valle, Curtis Dahl, son-in-law of FDR. So remember now, Miltier is there with Curtis Dahl of the Liberty Lobby, former son-in-law of Franklin Roosevelt, and Colonel Arch Roberts, who had been the architect of General Edward Walker's pro-blue program in the military. Another blue wink for you guys. In addition, Miltier had attended the April 1963 meeting in New Orleans, the Congress of Freedom. This guy was deep in all the groups, and the groups were active. And there's a lot of associations I should mention here, like H.L. Hunt, the Murchisons and stuff. I mean, Big Oil was involved in this. There's a lot of fascist influences pulling at the seams. This is how it was described in the book, The Awful Grace of God by Larry Hancock. A meeting of elite figures devoted to the cause of white supremacy who secretly discussed deploying strike teams to kill a host of public figures. This meeting, including high-ranking industrialists, bankers, and insurance executives with access to great amounts of money. Now, believe it or not, I think that the white supremacy thing is a smokescreen put in there by the Central Intelligence Agency. And I'll explain how that works, because Garrison discussed this, how he'd have somebody who was the perfect link around this deep state function, and then they'd throw something in there. They'd have to put some kind of tag on it to take it off. Be like, oh, it was a KKK thing or whatever it happened. Well, this is a little different. In other words, the Congress of Freedom was an example of the dialectical nature of the American deep state, with at least some groups in it dedicated at that time to the removal of others. This is important. We're at that same stage now. One part of the deep state wants to get rid of the other part of the deep state. So it's not deep state versus good guys. It's one part of the deep state versus the other part of the deep state. And I'll elaborate on that, but back to Professor. Miltier's remark to Somerset that Oswald's group, this is what happens. I should explain this. So Miltier, he makes this incredible prediction. He says, oh yeah, Kennedy's going to be hit. And the informant asks him, how's it going to be done? He says, oh, he's going to be hit by a high-powered rifle from an office building. And he says, oh yeah, right away they're going to have to pick up somebody just to throw the public off. He predicts it note by note by note. Now, this is Miltier. This is about a decade before the assassination. He's a younger guy here. By the time he's making these predictions to this informant, Willie Somerset, this is what he looks like. And what happens is he makes these incredible predictions about what's going to go down. And they assign an FBI agent named Don Adams to try to keep an eye on him. And when he does and tracks his movements and things, the FBI gets rid of his reports, oddly enough. So at a certain point, our friend gets in touch with Somerset and he says, you know what? I'm gonna be in Dallas. And basically it's going down. Now, Miltier not only knew it was going to happen from an office with a high-powered rifle and that they were going to grab somebody to throw the public off, but he knew it was going to happen in Dallas. He knew all of that. Miltier was deep in the Liberty Lobby. He was deep in that whole process, the whole milieu we've talked about. There is a picture that various Kennedy committees tried to look at. And the person who interviewed him after the fact of the assassination for the FBI said clearly, that's Miltier outside on Elm Street, about to watch the assassination take place. So this is Miltier right here. These are other pictures of Miltier. But there he is with the Kennedy limousine passing. So Miltier knows it's going to happen from a building with a high-powered rifle, that they're going to pick up Oswald, and he knows where it's going to happen. How does Joseph Miltier know all of this? And if he knows all of this, and he's showing up at all these different groups, why are people like Dahl and all the rest of it associated with Miltier? And is it somehow in that milieu of information that these guys are part of an intelligence network, that they are getting this information? Or are they, somehow generating it? Is Miltier actually part of the whole thing? Miltier's background, I have a whole thing on it here, but I'm going to summarize it. Basically, he was born wealthy. He inherited money. And he seems like he was just kind of a lifelong agitator in Georgia, in Texas, and in other places, and about states' rights and constitutional parties and things of this nature, which on the surface, have all the right principles and ideas, but then he goes into this whole kind of freak out about how the government is controlled and we need to violently overthrow the government and all that kind of thing. So when we're dealing with Miltier, we're dealing with that strain. The question is, what on earth did Miltier know? Now, after the assassination, he gets in touch with Somerset and he says, he's overjoyed. He goes, I told you, didn't I tell you it was going to happen exactly like that? And Somerset's, yeah, well, how did you know? Whatever. And he goes, don't worry about it either, because, Oswald's group was penetrated. And so it'll never, ever come back to real patriot. So Professor Scott really wondered what was going on there about Oswald's group being penetrated. And he thought that a lot of the other researchers had got it wrong, and that they were thinking Oswald's group meant some communist group or some Cuba thing. What he figured out was that there was an Alpha 66 group that Oswald, on the right side, was involved with in Dallas, and that it was that group where they piggybacked on some element of the Central Intelligence Agency being aware and controlling Alpha 66, got involved there. And that is what Miltier is referring to. A couple of quick things here. Miltier did not just predict the Somerset, the mode of assassination, as many critics have noted. He had also predicted the cover-up. Quote, they will pick up somebody within hours just to throw the public off. After the assassination, Miltier added further details about the cover-up, 3 of which deserve far more attention than they have generally received. The first is Miltier's remark to Somerset that Oswald's group was infiltrated by the Patriot Underground, and that arrangements had been made from there to have the execution carried out. Like other critics, Dick Russell assumed that this group was Oswald's chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, except that was just a front thing. Miltier's remarks about the infiltration of Oswald's groups were corroborated by a much more established figure, former U.S. Ambassador Claire Booth Luce. On October 25th, 1975, she phoned CIA Director William Colby to tell him that in 1962 and in 63, she had been sponsoring anti-Castro activities by the Cuban group, the DRE. Now, this is so important because the DRE is the group that was being given money by George Joannidis, who they hid Joannidis' identity now just until last month. That's the only time that we even found out that he was doing it officially. And so on. So Luce gives her whole thing. What she says basically is that Oswald had been working with a group and that people had infiltrated his group that he was working with. It seems to me that he was probably infiltrating a group himself and they stuck him out there as a stooge on the CIA side. The FBI identified a group, the chapter, as Alpha 66, as an organization. SNFE is what they called it. There's abundant evidence that this group was infiltrated by U.S. right-wingers, what they called Minutemen. Now, what's interesting is there's a group, there's a guy actually, he's a businessman in Winnipeg, and he's at an airport, and it's right after the assassination, and he's like an insurance guy, and he is sitting there in this restaurant that he always goes to, and there's only 3 other people in there, but those people are going off, and one of them has a wig on, and it was kind of a weird appearance, and that's David Ferry. And he starts talking all about the assassination and how it was pulled off and how they were going to go to Mercury, Nevada for further plans. And Mercury, Nevada is where the Atomic Energy Commission is. But this guy, goes off into the details and all the rest. What's fascinating is he remembered the character in the Winnipeg airport, who was Ferry, saying that they were doing in Missouri at this hotel, this great meeting, his group. And when he called up the hotel to find out about it, he was spotted by one of the people who was sitting there with Ferry, and he got up and left, and the guy followed him through the airport, and he went to security and all the rest. He reported this whole story in 64 before Ferry got on the news or anything in 1968. And what happened was he tracked down the hotel and he called them and he said, "What is the group that's coming in that's doing a big event at your hotel?" And the hotel said, "We have a big textile group meeting." That group, the kind of militant group that is associated with everything from advanced technology to covert operations, was meeting under the guise of a textile group and getting together and what we call back there Minutemen and stuff, and how this is all around this milieu of the Liberty Lobby and Walker and Oswald and all the rest of it, is all a fantastic play of how to put these figures forward. And it's quite fascinating because whoever was operating it, Miltier was the ear on all of it. And going with Liberty Lobby, with Dahl and other people like that, he knew all the details, and he was spilling all the details 2 weeks before the assassination occurred. Somehow, he knew. And when we think about it, and we think about Miltier, he's associated with all of these groups we just mentioned. Somehow in that milieu, they knew what was going to happen. My feeling is that the Central Intelligence Agency was deeply embedded in those groups, and that someone on the inside, some real deep player on the inside, was associated with Miltier, and Miltier was just flip enough to talk to Somerset and brag a little bit. And I think there's a lot of information in that. And with that, Miss Olivia, your last question of the evening.
Okay, before we get to the last question, Glenn, I wanted to share with everybody, Walter Bosley's in the chat. And he
Excellent.
said, just got back from my final CT scan in my adventure with cancer. It's the all clear one. So
Incredible.
congratulations, Walter.
Wow. Wow. Fantastic. Uh, you can't even imagine the incredible challenge. Wow. Fantastic. Great news. What have you got?
Okay. So I guess for the end, I am going to end with this the obvious metaverse. Does DJ think that the secret societies are able to manipulate our perception of reality to such a large extent that they can rewrite our perception of events?
Well, I mean, covert groups have incredible ability and they work, you know, imagine think tanks getting together and doing this stuff. I mean, it's remarkable. And they get together and they craft narratives, and some of the narratives work and some don't. Think of the Kennedy narrative. The CIA has tried to tout that position for 60 years with the media and everything else. The official version is still the stupid, Oswald in the sixth floor with an old gun and the magic bullet. The whole thing is nonsense for anyone who looks into it. So that's where the standoff stands. And now they have this thing about, oh, we're let records out or whatever. But it hasn't been substantial, really, has it? Just like the committees aren't substantial. It's nothing you can really point to and say, well, that changed, everything. So their hold on it is one thing, and officially they can hold it. But in terms of the actual perception of the public, the cover up didn't really work because the public understood, these deep agencies assassinated the president. The question always came up in the grand scheme of things, why? And people have offered a number of things. But if you look at the hardcore aspect of why the immediacy was there for him as a threat, and I'm sure there are a number of reasons to get rid of him, but the aerospace reason for his sharing that exotic technology with the Russians, who they were at mortal combat with, who were mortal enemies, and especially of that element in the CIA and NASA that came out through that milieu of advanced technology in Germany and all the rest, that is anathema to those people, and they would form that together. And it shouldn't be missed that one of the things that came up when we were talking about those very, very unusual groups was the whole White Russian piece, because as I mentioned, when it came up, people like de Mornschild, who show up in the middle of the Oswald story, you have this millionaire, cultured, incredible oil geologist guy, and he's palling around with the, broke 23-year-old guy who stacks books. It doesn't add up, right? So, but when you put it in the other way, which is this group has got there and they're kind of a stronghold, and they are pre-Bolshevik, they come from the Nicholas reign, and that's where their power base was, and that's where their riches were, and they were thrown out basically. So those Russians, they want the ability to get rid of that leadership and reclaim that. So they come out of that milieu, and a lot of that right wing White Russian thing is all around Oswald, and they embrace him, and the Paines are part of that, and they have him there. It doesn't make any sense historically, because if he was a raving communist and they are White Russians who hate the Soviets, then it wouldn't add up. But if he was just playing a role and they were helping him play it, that's completely different. So what it looks like, they're staging over here and then they're staging over here. Judith Exner, Sinatra, Marilyn, all that stuff, Shankana, it's staging. So somebody's carefully staging this, they're carefully staging that. So you're looking at a very deep milieu. And when you look to the next level, you think about things like remote viewing and the psychic spies and all the rest of it, and the UFO file involvement in this. Yeah, there are very, very deep levels. But just on an intel level of narrative control, they are writing the script of these people's lives. And, from Howard Hughes to Sinatra, they know how to use them. And some of it's in entertainment, some of it's media, some of it's financial, some of it's space. They're in every level. So that's, I think, the best way to look at it. And with that, Miss Olivia, that is the end of our episode.
Okay, I want to share this. Peter Nuss says, tomorrow is a high Illuminati day, the Black Moon. 1212 opens the gate of the Black Moon tonight. A time of reflection, a time to review one's own darkness, to rebuild or remind. Stay positive all, be the light.
Wow. It's incredible. Absolutely fantastic.
I have to do more research on what the Black Moon is all about.
And a perfect note to end on. Of course, today is the 22nd. And your super chat.
Okay. Ramblin' Lamb, Jay Parsons, Sean Dunn, Jonathan McIntosh, Best Cat Brock, Slow Time, JT, Melody Lenz, Eurythmia's Fun, Joe Silva, Retro Renovo, The Bikini Truther, Short Order Cook One, Armageddon, Terry Doherty, David Donaway, Ricky Tiki Tavi Dalam, Just in Case 008, Babar J. Provolone, Amarillo Gunrunners, Karen Carpenter, David Lowry, Fulcanelli, Erica Swenson Elliott, Amaretto Eyes, Mike Brosnahan, Donna Marie Farrell, and Conrad. Thank you so much for your generous super chats. We had to buy a lot of books this last week.
That's true.
They're
Actually,
still coming
fantastic. Incredible. And to all our supporters, thank you for subscribers. And we couldn't do what we do without you. We will be back next week. We have some exciting interviews coming up for you. And I'll do a couple of shout outs here before I go. That is a shot of Kennedy with LeMay. And always like that picture. I think it captures the challenge going on there for the president and their disregard for his directives and other. It comes off occasionally. This is another one, which is Kennedy with J. Edgar Hoover. And I think, again, the expression on the face gives us everything. Picture says 1,000 words. And, I think Kennedy is thinking, how can I get rid of this guy? And J. Edgar Hoover is thinking, how can I get rid of this guy? And then J. Edgar Hoover gets the idea, oh, wait, let me call the CIA. Let's see what we got here. Heather Sansoon. Yes, Dark Moon with the Dark Journalist. There you go. You got the right idea. Thank you, Heather. Jessica Rodriguez, it's great to see you out there. Let's see what here. Fulcanelli, Raspberry Sunday for Olivia.
Oh, I'd love that.
Donna Marie Farrell. Thank you, Daniel and Olivia. Love you guys. Thank you, Donna. We love you. And Tim Houston. Thanks, DJ and Olivia. You rule. Thank you, Tim. Tim, are you in Australia? I forget. I think you are. If I got that wrong, that's on me. Let's see. DA, thank you. And thanks, Ideas Room. Thank you. Deborah Gleason. Thanks, DJ and Olivia. Off to set intentions. If you know, you know. Absolutely. The intention is right on. Incredible. Let's see. Thanks, DJ and Olivia. Of course, it was great to have Joseph out there. Congratulations, Walter. Incredible. Hoover should have been in horror films. Creepy. Isn't that the truth? My God. Unbelievable. I always learn so much in each episode. Thank you. Karen Carpenter. Love to everyone. What amazing times we are enjoying together. Right. And getting through. Satan's favorite helper after Dulles, J. Edgar Hoover. Unbelievable. Can you imagine that?
I think Lyndon Johnson was up there.
Every time I think there isn't anything new to learn, you prove me wrong. Great show, Dark Journalist. Thank you, Najat. Unbelievable. It's great to see you. Yeah, there's so much. Well, there's a lot to learn. Excellent live stream. Thank you. Philip Blair. Great to see you out there. Sir Esther Taylor. Ricky Tiki Dalam. Corey Anderson. Yes. Thank you, Corey. Thank you for being here. Great to see you out there. What else? Surface Planet Radio. Great name. I like that. Do you do shows, Surface Planet? I like that name. Thank you, DJ and Miss Wings Girl. Havardian. That was Fern Fakes, folks. Can't wait to rewatch this. Thanks, DJ and Olivia. Avadian. It's great to see you, sir. Scarlet Fire, much love to all. Don New Way, great question, sir. Wow. And the show was a prequel, indeed. Indeed. But you've had some great comments in there, sir. Corey Anderson, wow. Just a sweeping hardcore ideas from tonight. Dark Journalist Romper Room. There you go. Wow, what a time. I like that. We'll leave the final word with DA, and thank you all so much. We'll be back with you next week. Unbelievable. And have a fantastic weekend. And of course, it says end broadcast, but
Never really ends.
never really ends. And never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and there could be again. Keep our eyes on the prize, and have a fantastic night, everyone.
God bless everybody.